Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our Replication event here at the Royal Society. It's great to see so many of you here in the audience for what I hope will be a fantastic afternoon's discussion and debate. So, I want to kind of set the scene and say a few words. First of all, I'm Darrell O'Connor, and I'm chair of the British Psychological Society's Research Board. And I'm also currently the chair of what's known as the Joint Committee for Psychology in Higher Education. And what this event has very much been conceived by the Joint Committee. And the Joint Committee comprises of the British Psychological Society, the Association of Heads of Psychology Departments, and the Experimental Psychology Society. And indeed, the reason why you're here is because of a meeting we had last year where myself, David Donaldson, who's here in the audience representing AHPD, we have John Towes, who's unable to be here representing EPS, Lisa Morrison-Coulthard, who's the lead policy advisor from the BPS, and Katrina Morrison, also representing BPS. And we had a conversation about the publication of the science paper by Brian Nozak and the Open Science Collaboration. And we felt it was important that psychology started to discuss this, the implications of this work, and to be open and public to try and move things forward. And indeed, what we decided was we wanted an event, which is the aim of today's event, to have an upbeat, positive, collegiate conversation, debate, and discussion about some of the issues raised by the publication of this paper. It's great, you can do things without even touching it. And so what we want to do is kind of very much kind of be upfront and public. As you know, the Nozick paper very much questioned replication and the ability of psychological science to be effective, to be reproduced, and it raised concerns about methodology, about statistical practices, and many other issues linked to transparency and how we actually do the work that we do. But from my mind, what I feel, and personally from the BPS's point of view, we see this as a huge opportunity. It's a huge step forward, an opportunity for us, psychology and psychological science, to lead the way. Because as you know, we are not alone. Genetics, clinical medicine, many other disciplines also have reproducibility problems. And indeed, our statistics look quite good in comparison. However, what we want to do today is to deal with the problems, think about solutions, and get some sort of feedback from our own community and broader to discuss this publicly and with science practitioners and policymakers, etc. But my basic view is that the idea that the publication of that science paper last year is revolutionary for our discipline. And the reason why I believe that is because I believe it offers us this opportunity to propel ourselves forward, to do things that other disciplines aren't doing, and ultimately to improve scientific practice, research methods, and transparency. And hopefully by the end of today, these are the sort of issues that we will grapple with and somehow at least come to some sort of mini conclusions about. That's all I want to say about the event, but a couple of things about what's going to happen now. If you look at your program, we have an excellent afternoon debate ahead. I want to introduce you first of all to something that's called Slido. And I'm going to become very Britain's Got Talent now, okay? Can you please reach into your pockets and raise your mobile phone aloft? Excellent. I never thought I would ask people to do such a thing. Indeed, I feel like Simon Cowell. Great. So what can I ask you to do now is go to your browser, open your browser, and type in slido.com. And please do it live now. And once you get to that page, all you simply have to do is type in the code 5648. Smile and hoot if you manage to achieve that. Has anybody achieved that? Yes, great. So what Slido does is it will allow us, throughout this event for the next couple of hours, it'll allow you to engage in this debate. If there's questions that you want us to discuss in the panel afterwards, please quickly write them. I want to know about your concerns about why we're using P is a crucial significance test. You can also ask about Marcus's jacket, but maybe that's less interesting today. And what you'll do, and if you engage with it and like each of the questions, popularity will then be ranked, and those questions will then be discussed at the end. So I believe that brings me to a couple of minutes before we start the main proceedings. We also want to be fully interactive. We want you to follow us on our Twitter, so use Twitter, and if you are using Twitter, please use the hashtag #PsychDebate. If you need Wi-Fi, you can log on using the brilliant password that can only be existing in the Royal Society here, Newton plus Apple. And please very much engage, because this is a legacy event we want to ensure also. And what we want to do is that after the event, it's been filmed here by the team at the Royal Society. It will then be freely downloadable and viewable on the BPS website on YouTube. And the questions you will ask will also be part of that. So please engage. Please try and stay for the whole event if you can. We're going to be very strict with time. And indeed, I'm ahead of schedule, I'm pleased to say, myself. And so what we want to do is hopefully just start a discussion how we can really improve our science and respond to the issues raised by Brian Nosak's paper. So what I'm going to do, first of all, is introduce our first speaker. So our first speaker is Marcus Manafo. And many of you know Marcus. Marcus has done a lot of work publicly, both on Twitter, on his blogs, and more widely on radio and elsewhere, very much talking about the issues to do with reproducibility. Do we have a crisis or do we not? So can you please put your hands together to welcome Marcus Manafo for our first presentation.
Thanks, Darryl. Thank you to the BPS and the other sponsors for inviting me. And as you can see from my talk title, what I'm going to try and do is reframe the debate slightly so that we move away from thinking about this as a crisis and think more in terms of what opportunities this presents for taking a look at the way in which we do science and considering the fact that many of our processes are fairly out of date, to put it kindly. Our publishing models essentially haven't changed in 400 years and are still predicated on the assumption that the best way to communicate our ideas is on dead trees. And our statistical tests, null hypothesis significance testing, that's 100 years old. Many of the ways that we work are out of date and could be brought up to date, and we should be thinking about that by applying the scientific method to the process of science itself. Because this is not a new issue. No less a figure than R.A. Fisher was concerned that Gregor Mendel, the father of modern genetics, had falsified or somehow manipulated his data. Now, Gregor Mendel was a monk, so if this is true, and there's some debate over whether or not it is, but if a monk was going to be going about falsifying his data back in the days where there was no real discussion of incentive structures or anything like that, then what hope is there for the rest of us? We all, by virtue of being here, will be familiar with the basic point, which is that nearly everywhere that we look within the biomedical sciences, there is growing concern that the rate at which we can reproduce the findings that are reported in the published literature is perhaps less than we would want it to be. Now, of course, exactly where that rate of reproducibility should be is an interesting question, because we can't ever aspire to the situation where everything that we publish is entirely reproducible, that all of the effects that we publish are completely robust, because then we would be stifling the groundbreaking, novel, and potentially risk-taking end of the spectrum of research that we do. But is the balance right? That's really the critical question. And so the paper that we've heard alluded to, the Nosak paper, published by the Open Science Collaboration last year in Science, as you know, took 100 papers or 100 studies that were published in 3 major psychology journals and attempted to replicate as closely as possible those original studies, working with the original study authors where possible, keeping the materials and the procedures as close to the original as possible. And you can see here on the left-hand side the p-value distribution of both the original studies and the replications, and the effect size estimates on the right-hand side of the original studies and the replications. And unsurprisingly, in the original studies, nearly all of the p-values were less than this entirely arbitrary 0.05 threshold that we tend to genuflect in front of, and the replication p-values were much larger on average. And for the effect sizes were larger in the original studies and reduced in the replication studies. There are various ways in which you can define replication in the context of these data. The headline figure was that about 40% of the studies could be replicated within this framework, but there have been Bayesian reanalyses of these data which suggest that there's a certain amount of ambiguity around that figure, as we might expect. But the question is, what does this tell us about the way in which we do science? Is there anything we can learn from this that would help us to improve the way in which we do science and perhaps bring some of our processes and procedures up to date? And what is the best that we can hope for when we need to be balancing risk and reward, discovery and confirmation in the incentive structures that we set for ourselves and our fellow scientists? One of the less heralded findings that came out of the Reproducibility project, which was published in a separate paper in the same year, was that these results didn't really come as a surprise to anybody. So some economists, led by Anna Draber, ran a prediction market where essentially you could buy or sell positions on the likelihood of an individual study replicating it. Because these were economists, they gave you real money to trade on that market. And over the course of a couple of weeks, you could move your position. So if you thought that a study was overpriced, because you thought it was less likely to replicate than the market thought, then you could sell that position. And if you thought it was underpriced because it was more likely to replicate than the market thought, you could buy that position. And so it was a dynamic, fluid way of capturing people's beliefs about which studies were going to replicate and which weren't. And you could trade on any study, so you didn't have to be a subject matter specialist. And I participated in this market and knew very little about any of the individual studies. I was really just using a few heuristics and my hunch, my Bayesian prior, if you like, about whether the results felt credible. But what you can see is that below the grey line are the studies that the market thought wouldn't replicate. Above the grey line are the studies that the market thought would replicate on average. And the black squares are studies that did replicate, and the red squares are the studies that didn't replicate. And what you can see is that where the market predicted non-replication, that was largely what we saw. That half of the figure is enriched for red squares. And where the market predicted replication, that was more or less what we saw. That section was enriched for black squares. So the results were largely known, implicitly, if you like, by the collective wisdom of the community, at least that part of the community that took part in this prediction market. So why did the results come as a surprise when they were published? Part of the problem here is that we don't have very good ways of communicating failures to replicate, null results, much of that held knowledge. And my own personal experience as a PhD student was that I tried to replicate a finding that from the literature looked absolutely nailed on, and I couldn't. And that was my first experiment, and my whole PhD was predicated on that starting point. And so I had a crisis of confidence and thought that maybe this wasn't for me. But then I spoke to people who'd been working in that area for years, and they said, oh, yes, everyone knows that those results are a bit flaky. That phenomenon doesn't really hold together as much as you would think if you read the studies. I didn't know that. How was I meant to know that? And a surprising number of early career researchers have recounted a very similar experience. The field, the community, knows that some results are much less robust than the literature would have us believe. But if you're coming into that literature from the outside, how are you meant to know that? So maybe part of what is driving this mismatch between what our data actually tell us and what we see in the published literature is this spectrum of behavior that the blogger Neuroskeptic has captured in this nice cartoon, which has become known as questionable research practices. Everything from overselling our results at one point, which of course to an extent we need to do to be able to get our next grant and to get promotion and so on, all the way down in the icy jaws of Satan to falsifying our data, which we would hope is extremely rare. I'm not going to talk about falsification today because I don't really think that's where we should be focusing our efforts. I think we should be focusing on this spectrum of behavior. And I think that we as psychologists are best placed to study this because ultimately there are no particular reasons to think that psychology is any better or worse off than any other aspect of the biomedical sciences. Every different field does some things well and some things less well. But fundamentally, what these issues of reproducibility capture are issues of how humans, because scientists are humans too, however much we try to pretend that we're impartial, how humans respond to incentives and to various aspects of their environment that shape their behavior in ways that are conscious and unconscious, and also captures the extent to which we, as humans, are subject to a range of different cognitive biases, which means that we can very easily fool ourselves, particularly if we're invested in our work, excited by it, enthusiastic about it, which as scientists we would hope we mostly are. So this is a very nice illustration of how that flexibility that questionable research practices allow us can lead to clearly ridiculous findings. And this may, again, be a study that you're familiar with. This is the study by Simmons and colleagues about 5 years ago now, which showed that with sufficient analytical flexibility, you can arrive at a conclusion that is clearly ridiculous. Here, that participants randomized to listen to When I'm 64 by the Beatles became younger. Not felt younger, became younger. And this was an experimental design, so of course it must be causal. And what they showed in this abstract was that if you present a redacted version of what you did, which is what's shown in bold, you can arrive at that p-value less than 0.04, and therefore it must be true. But if you also show the unredacted account of what you did, which is shown in full, then it clearly means that that p-value was arrived at through a process of multiple testing and analytical flexibility, which means that you really shouldn't give it as much weight as you would do if you only saw the redacted version. I'll just give you a moment to read that if you haven't seen it. So the point here is that lots of data were collected, there was lots of flexibility in how those data were analysed, there were lots of covariates that could be added and removed from the model, and if you did that enough times, then of course, like rolling dice, you would eventually hit on a double six, and if you then worked your way backwards from the process that got you to that double six, you could tell a narrative that could look quite compelling if you removed the denominator, if you like, for the number of times that you roll the dice. And this isn't a problem that's unique to the behavioural literature. This is a nice analysis by Joshua Karp from 2012. Two main findings emerged from this systematic review of the fMRI literature. One on the right, which is difficult to see, I'm afraid, was that a great deal of methodological detail that you would need to have or to know to be able to reproduce the study exactly was simply missing from the paper. In many cases because of things like length limits and the fact that you have to condense your methods to fit with the journal requirements. But more importantly, out of approximately 240 unique fMRI studies, there were approximately 240 unique analytical pipelines. In other words, almost no two studies analysed their data in the same way. Because with fMRI, there is such a large analytical space for you to work within that the number of permutations is enormous. And each analytical decision can be principled, but if you can make lots of those analytical decisions and then select only those which give you the most compelling results, then of course those compelling results, in fact, will be much less robust than the statistics reported for that analytical pipeline only might lead you to believe. And this is a problem that has become known as the garden of forking paths. We start with our data, and often we are very explicitly encouraged to explore our data. Now, of course, there's nothing wrong with exploratory data analysis, but we need to take into account the fact that it is exploratory when then reporting the results. Because actually, what I would argue is that many scientists essentially go on a quest for this pot of gold at the end of the garden, this p-value less than 0.05, and they take lots of missteps along the way, retrace their steps, go off in a different direction, and eventually get there. And they have this eureka moment that they found something. But of course, by virtue of having taken so many different paths, having rolled the dice so many times, that p-value doesn't mean what you think it means. You need to take the denominator into account. You need to correct for the fact that you have gone on this random walk through your data. It may mean something, but you would be less confident about that than if you had mapped out that analytical path a priori before you collected data and then followed it to the letter and arrived at the same p-value. The same p-value can be more or less convincing depending on how you got there. And actually, if you read the scientific literature, and in particular the psychology literature, it's clear that something's up, because nearly every psychology paper reports that it found what it was looking for. It's astonishing. We must have amazing ability to see the future. Darrell Bem shouldn't do research on the general population. He should study psychologists, because we have this uncanny ability to always find what we're looking for. And of course, the reality is that we often retrofit our hypotheses to the data. And I had an experience as a journal editor where an author was offered major revisions. And one of the reviewer comments was, "We were surprised you hypothesized X. We thought you would have hypothesized Y." And that's fine. He was just asking for a further exploration of the kind of theoretical models that underpin the work. But the authors came back and said, "Thank you for your comment. In response, we've changed our hypotheses." And the point was that they felt that that was so okay that they put it in their response letter. The culture that we've created around the need to have a narrative in our papers is so strong that people think that it's okay to say that. So what about incentive structures? Well, Jonathan Flint and myself, a few years ago, showed something similar for genetic studies, and that was replicated by Finelli and Ioannidis in 2013 on a larger scale, suggesting that where you do your research can have an impact on the reproducibility of the results that you generate, because you can be under more or less pressure to publish. Your own personal salary may be more or less dependent on your ability to get grants. There may be more or less direct financial reward for publishing in certain kinds of journals. In some countries, you receive a personal financial reward for publishing in journals like Nature that is equivalent to the annual salary of a medical doctor for publishing one paper. In certain medical schools in the US, you can be a fully tenured professor, but fully 0% of your salary is guaranteed, and you have to make up your entire salary through grant funding. Now, how do those incentive structures, consciously and unconsciously, shape the behavior of scientists who also have to pay a mortgage? And how can we then use the limited resources that we have to maximize our ability to succeed within essentially this game that has been created by the incentive structures around us? One of my PhD students, Kate Button, a few years ago, now a lecturer at Bath, ran this analysis of very crudely studies that PubMed flagged as neuroscience studies, and showed that the average statistical power was certainly far less than the 80% that is considered to be the minimum conventionally. And of course, part of the reason for that may be that as a strategy for succeeding within the current incentive structures, given a finite set of resources, it may make more sense to slice those resources thinly into multiple studies, roll the dice multiple times in the hope that you'll get a double six, and then try to publish that study, rather than putting all of your investment into one single authoritative study that will probably give you the right answer, but that right answer might be uninspiring. It might only be a 3 and a 4. So what heuristics can we use to be certain about the quality of a study? Maybe we should rely on the institution that the study has come from. Malcolm MacLeod at Edinburgh, with this analysis that was published in PLOS Biology, looked at this in the context of animal studies and looked at various metrics that give us some sense of the quality of reporting, at least, of those studies, whether the animals were randomized, whether the experimenters were blinded, whether there was any evidence of a sample size calculation. Now, these are only elements of the study design that were reported. The fact that they're not reported doesn't mean that they didn't occur. But what he showed was that, first of all, the level of reporting of these measures of study quality was very poor, on average, across animal studies. But critically, that when he looked at institutions that performed in the top 5 in the REF, that are our best institutions in the country for this kind of research, the reporting of those measures of quality was on average lower, worse, than a study pulled at random from PubMed. So the studies coming out of our best institutions show worse reporting quality than a study pulled at random from PubMed. And you could say, cynically, that perhaps this is because the best way to get an eye-catching result is to run a poorly controlled study that isn't blinded, where there isn't randomization, that is too small. So we assume that this will all be okay because science is self-correcting. But that's an empirical question. We need to test that assumption. If we look at studies published in the British Journal of Psychiatry, 83 studies recommending effective interventions, almost half hadn't been subject to any attempt at replication, despite these recommending interventions. And of those which were subject to replication, some replicated, some suggested that the initial effect size was inflated, which shouldn't be surprising, but some were contradicted, not surprisingly. So maybe we don't do enough replication. And maybe we should get people who are impartial to judge the strength of evidence of data. This is a very nice article by Pangiatou and Ioannidis, which took a heterogeneous meta-analysis, an ambiguous meta-analysis, where the result depends on whether you use a fixed or a random effects model, that kind of thing, and showed it to 2 groups: primary study authors who'd published in that area, and methodologists who had no skin in the game. And not surprisingly, people who were invested in that area were more likely to believe that the meta-analysis supported their position than people who had no investment in that particular literature, who were impartial. We are not necessarily the best judges because we're invested, we're excited, we're enthusiastic. That's why we do science. And we can't rely on the published literature. We all know about publication bias, but there are other biases, and citation bias is a particularly pernicious one. This is a nice analysis by Stephen Greenberg from a few years ago. The specific literature doesn't matter so much. The point is that in the early 90s, and year of publication is on the y-axis, in the early 90s there were these primary studies which were enough to motivate an animal and cell culture literature, which is shown in blue on the right-hand side. And that proceeded onwards after those initial studies came to an end. In the initial studies, about half were supportive and half were critical. But that was seen to be enough to stimulate this second literature. But the second literature only cites the supportive data. Those are the black lines. There's one citation to the critical literature, and that's a negative citation going, well, there's this study, but it's terrible. So if you're a researcher coming into that new literature in blue, how would you find the critical data? How would you ever know that the foundations for the area that you're working in are much less stable than you would believe from the citations? You would have to do a lot of due diligence to find those articles. It's essentially hidden. And we've shown that similarly recently with some Dutch colleagues for the literature on the serotonin transporter gene and amygdala activation. First of all, abstracts often tend to overstate results relative to a balanced interpretation of the data that are actually presented within. But critically, of the quarter, roughly, of the studies that are null studies, which is the inside of that donut shown in light grey, they only receive about 3 to 4% of the citations. People don't cite the null results. People don't like bad news. People don't like people like me saying it's all terrible. But the point is that that then gives a very distorted impression of just how robust that literature is. It's one of the reasons why we need meta-analysis. And so the argument here is that the way that we do science is focused too much on productivity, and it is a bit like the US automobile industry in the 1970s, focused on productivity at the expense of quality control, with cars coming out of Detroit, someone checking the number of wheels and making sure the engine starts, and then the car breaking down later. These cars were built to be fixed later. Much of our science is created to be fixed later, but we're not doing enough of that fixing. And what happened in the US was that, and statistician Edward Deming saw what could be gained by adding quality control procedures to every step of the pipeline. He went to Japan, introduced those quality control procedures, and 50 years later, the Japanese automobile industry still has a reputation for quality. But not only, his insight was that not only do those quality control procedures improve the quality of what you produce, but that over time, they improve the speed of your workflow, they improve your efficiency. So my view is that part of the opportunity that is presented to us is to refresh the way that we do science. I think open science can be a big part of that, because processes like pre-registering your study protocols, really having to think about your hypotheses, making your data open, having to very carefully curate your data so that anybody could use them just by downloading them, act as quality control procedures, act as quality control checks on that research pipeline, so that no longer will we need to build research to be fixed later. There will always be a need for replication, but we can be more confident in the robustness of our data because there have been quality control checks along the way. And these solutions can work. So we see here that by requiring clinical trials to pre-state their primary outcomes, we go from a situation before 2000 where most of the trials reported a benefit of the intervention to a situation after 2000 where actually most results were null. And in fact, for the first time, one study showed a harmful effect of the intervention. The reality is that a lot of our results are unexciting. The experiments don't work, and we need to know that. And if you force people to be upfront about what their primary outcome is and what their hypothesis is, then you get a much more accurate representation than if you allow people to post hoc select what their primary outcome actually was, in this case in the context of clinical trials. And when we introduce badges for data sharing at Psychological Science, we see a dramatic increase in the rate of data sharing, just as the result of that relatively trivial incentive of putting a little badge on the paper that has open data associated with it. So there are solutions, and the solutions come about by applying the scientific method to the process of science itself, and as psychologists, thinking about how to shape behaviour positively. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marcus, for a very stimulating first presentation. So note that there are no questions. They will happen at the end. Remind you, Slido is live. Please use it. And also please tweet using Psych Debate hashtag. And indeed, now star in the first photograph. Smile. Excellent. Well done. Can I now welcome a second presentation today, which will be by Roger Watt. I hope. The slide I will now hopefully see here. And Roger's going to kind of shift the focus. Roger's going to consider the notion of, do we have a crisis? And how do we evaluate what is a crisis and what we should judge as good or bad replication? So from the University of Stirling, can I welcome Professor Roger Watt.
Thank you. I'm going to attempt, first of all, something which feels very risky at this moment, which is to run some live simulations of data collection and analysis in front of you, so we can see, broadly speaking, what sort of things happen when you do that. If it falls over, I have PowerPoint slides as a backup that have pre-prepared results to show you, but hopefully we won't need those. The Replication Crisis, Reproducibility Crisis paper, when it was published in Science, shocked many people. It does seem quite a severe headline. My purpose here is to give you, or those of you that haven't looked into this, one more big shock, and then ask ourselves where this leaves us. And although I don't take away from any of the arguments about hygiene in data collection and reporting, I believe that even if we did that, reproducibility itself won't change very much. And we have to be careful that we don't put ourselves into a very funny position. So, what you see on the screen is some software that was actually developed to teach statistics to undergraduates. Behind it, there's a computational algorithm that generates thousands and thousands and thousands of random samples from predefined populations with specified characteristics and does all the standard sorts of statistical tests on them. That's all my talk will rely on. So rather than trying to describe statistical results to you through the use of symbols and equations and everything else, I'm going to do the whole thing through simulation. Now, fingers crossed for me, please. What we have here is a simple hypothesis where I have an IV that's an interval variable, distributed normally, predicting a DV that's a similar variable, and I've put in, as a correlation strength, 0.3, which is, as you'll see, probably about where a lot of psychology operates. So that's this diagram here. I've also, and those of you at the back won't be able to see this, I've also said that we're going to have 42 participants. And we're going to take a random sample from the population. The population looks like this down here. And have a look and see what correlation coefficient we get. So here's my sample. There we are. If I go over, we can get the descriptive statistics. And we've got a correlation coefficient of 0.37, which is quite nice. I happen to know, and I've shared it with all of you, that the population correlation coefficient is 0.3. So I happen to know that I have an overestimate here. There's no earthly reason why it should be an overestimate. That's just the way it turned out. And of course, if I was any of us doing a psychological study in a laboratory somewhere, I don't know the population, so I have no idea whether my 0.37 is an overestimate or an underestimate. All I know is it's what I've got. Okay, I think I've been very lucky, but when I switched to look at the p-value, yes, I got a green light. There's my result. And the probability looks like it's about 0.02, 0.03, something like that. So not wildly exciting, but in our world, sufficient. Let's get another sample, right? Trust our luck. Very similar p-value. Now we've got one that isn't significant, red light. Going to do a few more. Those of you, oh, look at that. Those of you that have read the coming book, Understanding the New Statistics, will be aware of this as the dance of the p-values, which I think is a very nice term for it. What I'm going to do is set the engine running relatively slowly, and let's watch p-values accumulating. Do you get a sense that I do that the distribution of p-values from this fixed population, this fixed design, it's a bit like skating on very thin ice, isn't it? Somebody got, a career-breaking best result there, and quite a lot of people got bad news. Just to finish, just really to make the point, I'm now going to set it running in top gear. So it's running hundreds of studies, and it's accumulating the results in a histogram. And the green number you see halfway up is telling us how often we get a significant result. That's the statistical power of this system. And actually, the 0.3 and the 42 were chosen very carefully because they give me a median value, p-value of 0.05. So I know that we have a 50-50 chance of getting a significant result in this system. Now, I'm going to go to the slides in a second because I don't trust the software any further than that in front of... Every time I used it in front of students, it broke as if it knew. What this says is that, let's say there are 200 of you here. Roughly speaking, 100 of you are going to get a significant result, another 100 aren't. And let's say, for the sake of argument, it's some really exciting finding, you know, like diligence predicts your IQ. So we can be quite confident that someone will get a significant result and will publish it. The trouble is, the person sitting beside them who decides to do the replication has a 50-50 chance of not getting a significant result, right? So our replication rate in this very narrow particular instance is 50%. That kind of puts the science finding into some sort of context, actually. I'm going to take this 2 steps further in a minute, but I just want to make sure absolutely you've got this, right? Those people amongst you, actually, let's have a, I don't know whether, no, let me get rid of that. Oh, my talk, by the way, was called High Expectations. Right, and these were the slides that were backups. Here we are, right? Turns out that 10% of you, that's 20 of you roughly, get a p-value that's 0.47, call it 0.5, or higher, right? Another 10%, another 20 of you are getting a p-value that's basically less than 0.001, which is very exciting, yeah? That's how P behaves. And P behaves like that because of the way in which our values, correlation coefficients, map onto probability. We're looking at the tail of a distribution. Actually, it's a slightly asymmetric distribution, makes matters even worse. Yeah? Okay, right? There we have it. The issue is that p-values are subject to sampling error, sampling variability. Yeah? And there's nothing. If you're sitting there thinking to yourselves, but I'm an experienced researcher, I'll get a good p-value. Well, if you are thinking that, you must be cheating. Right? Because what you get out of this distribution, if your sample of participants is a random sample drawn from the population, what you get is a random point in that. Yes? There's no behaviour you can adopt legally that will determine where you are in this distribution at all. Right? Now, it is certainly true that there's a whole set of behaviours you can adopt that will push you down, that will actually push the whole distribution down. Yes? Increase your chances of getting a significant result by leading to an overestimate of the correlation coefficient. Right? Have we got that? Yeah? That's the issue. I want to say one more thing before moving on. Every one of the results that sits inside the green area, the publishable area, also has a correlation coefficient associated with it that's greater than 0.3, that is higher than the population correlation coefficient. Yes? Publication bias generates, without any question whatsoever, overestimates in practically every study that we publish. That's very important. So, first thing to notice is that miss rates. There was a finding to be made, and 50% of the people in this room didn't get it. That's a very high rate. And it carries this implication that the effect will be sound by someone, but there's a 50-50 chance of a subsequent failure to replicate. Now, please remember, we're still living in a privileged viewpoint. You and I know that the population correlation coefficient is 0.3. We know the effect is there. Right? So we can look at this 50% chance of subsequent failure to replicate and say, but those are incorrect failures to replicate if there's not too many negatives in that expression. Yeah? Pause there. Let that sink in. Failure to replicate in this situation, in the sense of failing to get a significant result the second time, shouldn't be enough evidence to veto the first finding. That seems absolutely clear. And I'd be happy later on in the day if anyone wants to expand further on that. It's a very tricky situation. Right. Now, I want to go back to two samples. And I'm going to show you them in this graph because it allows me to explain the situation very nicely. Along the x-axis here, we have the p-value for a replication sample, right? So the situation is we have an original sample marked by that green triangle just inside 0.05, and then we take a replication, and we're going to put it on this diagram, and its x position will be its own individual probability. Yeah, and anything to the right as a vertical green line, got that right? Yes, is a failure to replicate in the standard sense. What I'm going to plot on the y-axis is what happens inside my software when I simply concatenate, create the union of those two data sets and analyze it. Yes? So this is like the best possible meta-analysis. And I'm going to show you the p-value that you get from that combination of the two sets of data on the y-axis. So far, so good? You're not going to say anyway, are you? That marks out three regions in this diagram that we need to worry about. This one down here is the one that traditionally we would think of as all's well. The first study was significant and the replication was significant, and we all believe the effect exists. This one over here, sorry, let's go up there first of all. That one there is where the first study was significant. The second study wasn't significant, and actually when you put the two sets of data together, the results also isn't significant. And in that sense, there, I think one would very properly say no effect. This right-hand bottom corner is the more interesting area. It's where the replication itself failed to reach significance, but the combination of it and the original sample are significant. And we need to pay a little bit of attention to that in a minute. But let me put my second sample, which was just not quite significant, so 0.055 or something like that. I've put it there, so it's to the right of the vertical green line. But you can see that when we combine that data with the green triangle, the consequence is actually more significant than either of the two on their own. Here we have a situation where the logic I was trained as a scientist to believe in is that there's a failure to replicate, which means that there is no real effect. But actually, if we look at everything we know, the two samples we have, we're in a better position than we were before we did this. That's the promise of meta-analysis. I think there are very strong reasons why meta-analysis isn't yet giving us its full promise, but nonetheless, that would be a situation where we are... Did I go 2 slides then? Okay, so my second sample is a failure to replicate, but the combination is more significant than the original alone. Okay? Now, I'm going to take my original sample, and I'm just going to do the same thing I showed you. I'm going to run loads and loads and loads and loads and loads of replications and put them all on this graph. And what we have is the same 50-50 split, because these replications are still coming from that same population. Okay, but you can see that of those that don't reach significance on their own, a very large proportion are increasing the reliability of the overall result. Good. So, with a known population, and for my particular sample, the probability of a failure to replicate is 50%, right? Which is comfortably close to the science finding for me to feel maybe we need to think about this. What happens if we don't know where the population came from? Now, I'm going to speed through this because it's technicalities, right? I want to put on 2 constraints on what the population might have been. First one is, well, given my sample, this is the set of populations it could have been drawn with their relative densities. Okay? That's more or less where you get your confidence interval from. That one's very straightforward, that one's very statistical. So imagine, instead of taking all my samples from the fixed population, I'm now going to take them from inside that curve. Actually, I'm going to do one more thing, and And I'm going to throw in this, which is, for now, a speculative, a priori assumption about what the distribution of population effect sizes looks like in psychology. Yeah? I think it's probably fairly reasonable. If I run that and ask which of those studies gets published and what does the distribution of published effect sizes look like, then I get the orange curve. Okay? We're going to use the yellow one, but we're then going to see in publication the orange one. And on top of that, I've put the distribution of effect sizes from the science paper. So you can see those are comfortably within distance of each other. Okay? So we're using these two constraints to say, given my sample, what is the possible set of populations it could have come from? Same graph, and now I have a 60% failure to replicate. Okay, only 40% of the time does the replication sample, when it's drawn from all the possible populations my sample itself could have come from, do I get a proper replication? That 40% is feeling much more encouraging. The only thing I have to do now is to worry about other values of R and other values of N, because I've used R equals 0.3 something for my sample, 3.4, and N equals 42. So, what distributions of R and N should we use? Well, we've got a distribution of R, which I've just used. It's this, it looks okay. Here's a set of data on published N values from 2 journals over 90 years. And the white dots are the set of N that I've used in the last set of simulations. Okay, so they match it reasonably well, and I'm more than happy to deal with any questions about that later. Okay, so now I'm dispensing with my one sample that I've worked with so far. I'm going to have lots of samples, but I'm going to put them all through exactly the same process, work out the distribution of populations each could have come from, and work out what the replicability should be for that. Okay? So, actually it's more than 1,000 original studies I create. We keep only those that are publishable, and for each of those we do 1,000 replications in exactly the way the science paper does. And we simply count how often those 1,000 do we get a significant result. Okay? And the answer turns out to be somewhere between 40 and 45%. If everybody's behaving properly, replicability in psychology with these two constraints of the distribution of R and the distribution of N turns out to be like that. So, the only real free parameter in this is the distribution of a priori effect sizes in psychology, and I want you to notice that the effect does depend also on the distribution of N in psychology, but I've looked and used some real data for that. Now, this is more or less me finishing. If you accept, my distributions, R and N, then it necessarily follows that if everybody is behaving impeccably, the probability of a replication in psychology is 40 to 45%. Or, if you like, if it turns out that the probability of replication in psychology is 40 to 45%, then everybody's behaving impeccably. Yeah? One free parameter. What happens if we change that? Well, the red dots show you what the proportion, the percentage of replication should be as a function of the mean distribution of R values in psychology. The green dots are the science paper, so the two to the left are social psychology and the two to the right are cognitive psychology. The thing that strikes me, and the thing I want to leave you with here, is this. Not only are we getting more or less the same numbers, and there's some room for debate there, but we even get the same slope here as the science paper, and I hadn't expected that as a free gift at all. My conclusion, if everybody's behaving impeccably, then the probability of replication in psychology is typically 40 to 45%. And I want just to finish by saying this is inescapable. There is no hygiene, tidying up or anything else that will get you better than that. That's driven simply by the arithmetic of statistics. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Roger, for a thoroughly stimulating and somewhat controversial talk, I suspect. And I hope that people are using various social media to debate this as we speak. So moving on perfectly to time, we have Dorothy Bishop as our next presenter. And Dorothy needs no real introduction. She's somebody who has been writing fantastic blogs and papers and been very high profile on the issue of replication. And I'm personally very much looking forward to Dorothy's presentation. Dorothy Bishop.
Thank you. So we've heard before about the Garden of Forking Paths. I thought I'd just give you a bit of erudite history. It's actually a title of a short story by Borgeth, and it was picked up by Andrew Gelman, a statistician who is very interested in this whole area. And I will take you through how it's a very beautiful analogy of what tends to go on in psychological studies. But some of the problems that Marcus talked about, I want to sort of elaborate on and say the interesting thing is that this is not new. I mean, he talked about Fisher picking up Mendel, but there's another, which I regard as the key issue in this, which is the failure in psychology for us typically to distinguish when we are testing a hypothesis from when we're generating purely exploratory findings, and the consequent misuse of statistical tests and p-values. And the interesting thing is that this is a problem that has been recognized by statisticians for many years, but has not only been ignored, but it's actually been actively discouraged to take it on board in the psychology literature. And I think it's led us to enormous problems. And I do think we have problems, Roger, but we can talk about that at the discussion. I think issues of power are critical here. But de Groot is a fine Dutchman who unfortunately wrote in Dutch. And this was one reason why I think nobody has taken much notice of him until now, when he's been translated by the excellent E.J. Wagenmakers and colleagues, so that we can all benefit from his wisdom. But the main thing he wants to draw our attention to is the extent to which, if you are exploring a data set by finding interesting things in it and looking at it and then deciding how to analyze it, letting the material speak, as he describes, and having ad hoc decisions in how you process the data, then it precludes the interpretability of outcomes of statistical tests. In other words, you shouldn't be using p-values if you're doing that. And I will give some examples of why that is fairly disastrous and why most of us do it. But most of us do it, and here is an article advising the young, telling them that they should do it, which was written by Darrell Bem. You may not be able to read all of it, so I will read it for you. Which article should you write? There are two possible articles you can write. A, the article you planned to write when you designed your study, or B, the article that makes the most sense now you've seen the results. They are rarely the same, and the correct answer is B. Read data analysis. Examine them from every angle. Analyse the sexes separately. Make up new composite indices. If a datum suggests a new hypothesis, try to find additional evidence for it elsewhere in the data. If you see dim traces of interesting patterns, try to reorganize the data to bring them into bolder relief. If there are participants you don't like, or trials, observers, or interviewers who give you anomalous results, drop them temporarily. Go on a fishing expedition for something, anything interesting. And I just love the blurb for the book in which this invaluable advice is given, which was a very, very influential book. This book provides invaluable guidance that will help new academics plan, play, and ultimately win the academic career game. Now, some of us don't think doing science is an academic career game and are rather concerned that this advice has been followed by many, many people. I have followed it over the years. I read this at a crucial moment in my development and thought, oh, really? Oh, well, perhaps I've been doing it all wrong. Why is it wrong? Okay, let's have a look what actually happens and why de Groot is right and Bem is completely and utterly wrong. Sort of thing I'm interested in is handedness and whether it's associated with various developmental disorders. So suppose I've got a nice big population, I've gathered tons and tons of data on handedness, and I think that there's a link, I'm testing whether there's a link between attention deficit hyperactivity disorder and handedness. And off I go and do my analysis, looking for this association, And I have a group with ADHD and I have a typical group, and I tried to find a significant difference. I don't find one, but the probability of me finding something by chance is 1 in 20, it's 0.05. But I think, well, I've got young and I've got old people in this, and Daryl Bem has said I should divide them up, so I've divided them up, and in the young it's looking a bit more promising. And it's not quite 0.05, but it's creeping in that direction. In fact, now, if I were to find a significant result, the true probability is actually 0.1, because it's not just the p-value you're looking at, as Marcus says, and p-value does not have meaning in its own right, it is the context in which it occurs, and this is the point that people really don't seem to get. So let's go a bit further and say we have two measures of handedness. I've got a skill measure and a performance measure, and I decide that the skill measure looks more promising. And I am nudging, or I might have even reached p is less than 0.05, only if I ignore all the other things I might have done, then I don't realise that, in fact, I've now got a 1 in 5 chance of getting, 0.19 chance of getting something that's significant, because there are all these forking paths that need to be also considered. It's worse than this, in fact, because particularly in an area like handedness, you often don't know how many forking paths there are, and that's a point that de Groot makes, because there are numerous ways I could be dividing up my handedness measure. I could be dividing into left and right-handers, or very right-handed and not so right-handed, and so on. There are things that are not apparent that you're doing, which are the forking paths. Sex, I could divide them up into. Urban or rural. I mean, one can think of all sorts of strange things that you could potentially use. But basically, you get to the end of this forking path, and the chances of getting a significant, in other words, less than 0.05 p-value for that subgroup, young urban females measured on a measure of hand skill, is now 0.56. So the issue here is that you've got a good chance of finding something that is not true, that looks convincing, because you've been making all these decisions in the analytic pathway. Many people have been trained well enough to know that if you've got a lot of variables, you need to do some sort of correction for multiple contrasts when you do your statistics. Very few people seem to understand that the same logic applies to having many different analytic possibilities. And this is, to me, the serious problem that pervades not just psychology, but many other sciences, because as Ben would point out, it seems the right thing to do, to explore your data, to find something interesting in it. But if you're not taking on board the fact that you've got these forking paths, you are misleading yourself. And this problem is exacerbated by the relative ease with which we can gather these huge multivariate data sets, the ease with which we can press a few buttons on SPSS and run the analysis time and time again and find one that looks good. And people are doing this, they don't try to do this to cheat. This is thought to be useful exploration of the data, but if you do it without awareness of how you're messing with your p-values, you're going to mislead yourself. And the whole problem comes down to exploratory analysis being interpreted using p-values, and p-values really do presuppose a priori hypothesis that you have specified. And as soon as you depart from that, the p-value becomes meaningless. Doesn't mean you can't explore your data, it means that you can't explore your data and interpret the p-values. If you want to explore your data to find something interesting, then you would need to replicate what you had done before you could really believe it. And there's a huge bias, therefore, in our field for type 1 error. And it's very hard to remember which is type 1 and which is type 2, but to me this is the best slide I've ever seen for distinguishing the two possibilities, but finding something that isn't actually there. So what can we do? Well, I'm with Roger, at least as far as simulated data sets are the way to go. I think it's the ideal way to get an understanding of what we're doing with our statistical methods that we're all taught. And I think that when students are taught statistics, they shouldn't be taught the computations alone. They should be taught to simulate data, but I think they should be taught to simulate random data, because then you can really see how easy it is to fool yourself. I was almost going to run a live simulation. I didn't have your courage, Roger. So I actually did a simulation, just a simple little thing in Excel, where I then have, these are the slides from it. But this is just really very simple, saying instead of having one correlation, we've got correlations, we've got 8 variables. So we've got a little correlation matrix here, And we've got 10 subjects. In fact, the sample size won't affect this because it will just affect the size of correlation. But the statistical significance levels obviously are taking into account the sample size. But here's one run of this correlation matrix, and there's one significant 0.05 level value in what was essentially random data. There's no relationship in this data set. I think many people seeing this would, though, start to think, wow, there's an interesting relationship between E and F. 0.738, that's huge. I will plot the thing, I will send it to Nature, etc. This is the next run, the same simulation. Wow, minus 0.648. Opposite direction, different variables, which is what you'll get with this sort of simulation. Third run, nothing. How disappointing. Fourth run, we've got 2, 3. We've got one at 0.01. Oh, great excitement. But this is because you're actually looking, this is why the context is critical, you're looking at over 20 correlations here, and if you take a 0.05 level of significance, it's going to be quite likely that one on any one run comes up significant. So this is, I think if all students were just taught to do this, they would get less excited when they see the occasional p-value less than 0.05. So we've really got to overcome this bias to overinterpret what we observe. And we know as psychologists there's this huge bias. So this is a phenomenon, I gather, known as pareidolia, Jesus in toast. How many pieces of toast do we have to look at before we find one that we can believe has got Jesus in it? If every time you got a bit of toast and this popped up and nobody else got it but you got it from the same toaster, I think you might start to think God's hand was at work. But occasional pieces of toast that look like this, of course, one shouldn't get excited by. Let me give another example that shocked me, and which I did blog about, because this problem of having multiple things that you're looking at affecting your p-values affects multi-way ANOVA, and most people don't realise, and I certainly didn't realise that, and it's a really major problem. I was doing studies in the field of ERP, so electrophysiological recordings, and I was finding that you're measuring these sort of little brain waves. Let's have a look at if I can get the spot. These sorts of things, averaging over many trials. This is time. This is some sort of potential. And I remember trying to analyse some data where we were interested in the size of one of these components, and it didn't look terribly exciting. And the reviewers and the editor concurred that shouldn't we look at other electrodes, because at other electrodes more exciting things seem to be going on, very much a sort of BEM approach. And with this sort of thing, you can look at electrodes, you can look at time intervals, you can do frequency analysis, you can vary how you decide to measure these peaks and so on. And in this field, you often see people doing analysis with 4 or 5 ways analysis of variance, with perhaps you've got 2 groups looking at 2 sides of the head, different electrode sites, different conditions. And you run an ANOVA, and my God, you're going to get something. And we tend to think that ANOVA automatically corrects p-values, but it doesn't. It corrects for the number of levels within a factor, but not for the number of factors and interactions. This is another output from a simulation. This time, the rows are runs of the simulation, and reading across, you've just got these are, again, random data, complete noise data is entered into this, but as if it were data from 2 groups, so 2 sides of the head, various locations of electrodes, different tasks, and you've got a total here of, I think it's 15 things that you can look at, 4 main effects, 4 two-way interactions, 6 two-way interactions, 4 three-way interactions, and 1 four-way interaction. On each run, you can find usually something that comes out significant, sometimes very highly so. Some runs it doesn't happen. Now, if you had predicted in advance, so if you were hypothesis testing, if I'd said, I'm predicting an interaction between my group and my task, you can see if you run down, it's about right. It's only about 1 in 20 is significant of 0.05. The point is, if you're looking at everything and anything and going to interpret anything that comes out of this, you are going to get false positives. How do we cope with this and recover from this ghastly situation? I think there are various things we can do. The first is the playing with random numbers and putting them in your statistical analysis and checking what sorts of things come out the other end. The second is to distinguish exploration from hypothesis testing, and you can do that with replication. It's a sort of thing that now in genetics is pretty much standard because they ran into huge problems with finding false positives. And if you've got a big data set, you might want to subdivide it into two. Chris is going to talk about another option, which is to pre-register your analyses, so you have your hypotheses fully specified in advance. This doesn't stop you exploring your data, but it means that it's very clear what is exploratory and what is not, and when the p-values are meaningful. And then I think there are other solutions which are not down to us, the psychologists, to adopt, but are down to the journals. People have talked about the difficulty of publishing negative results. These are all things I have blogged about. And like I've got here, this is funny because it would never happen. If you did a study and showed that the amygdala makes no difference whether you're a Christian or an atheist, you cannot imagine nature being interested in that. Whereas if you found the opposite, if you found that atheists had bigger amygdalas than Christians, wow, that would make a Nature paper. So we want to get rid of that sort of stupidity. There's the same sort of thing, newsworthiness trumping methodology, very small sample sizes, paper being accepted if it finds something supposedly exciting, and a failure to publish replications. I've had instances where people have said, well, this is all very well, but it's a replication, so we're not interested. Whereas my view was, wow, I've actually managed to replicate something. Goodness, right. I think also there are solutions for institutions. One of the problems is the incentive structure that Mark has already alluded to. We should stop worrying about the impact factor of journals that people publish in. We should be much more ready to reward people who do reproducible research, and that means having adequately powered studies, for example, so that we get away from the kind of problems that Roger's talking about. If you've got a big enough sample size, then your things should replicate. You can compute the power. Instead of worrying about grant income when giving people promotions and jobs, we should consider whether what they've done with the income that they have is good and is reproducible, and not just count how much money comes in. And we should reward people who adopt these sorts of open science practices. Funders, I think, are getting on board because they're getting fed up with wasting money. They want to promote data sharing and are beginning to do that. Provided you can do it, of course, without having problems with confidentiality, which in psychology can be an issue. But also they should be funding well-designed replications of key findings, encouraging pre-registration, and perhaps scrutinising people's methods a bit more, because sometimes there's just an assumption that if you're sufficiently good to get a grant that you must know what you're doing, and I think all the evidence is that that is unfortunately not always the case. So my bottom line message is that I think as psychologists we know that we can fool ourselves very easily. There's a whole literature on how people make decisions and form their beliefs, and we are not natural scientists in the sense that the way our brains work is to seek confirmation of what we think is true and to get excited when we see patterns in things, and not to sort of take a step back and try and disprove our hypothesis. So I think that's all got to change. And I'll just leave you there with some links, which I think will be made publicly available. Somebody was asking about that. I have more slides on this, and there are a lot of links, including a nice talk one by Chris and one by Marcus at this symposium at the Academy of Medical Sciences, which was last year. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Dorothy, for a fantastic presentation. And Jesus and toast is a thing I wasn't expecting to hear today. So very well done on that. So we move to our final talk of the first half of our event. And I'd like to welcome Chris Chambers. Chris is a professor at Cardiff University. And Chris, as many of you will be aware, is someone who's been trailblazing some of the solutions in how we can deal with replication. And indeed, in the work he's going to talk about today is the idea of pre-registration and how that might be a useful tool going forward. So please put your hands together for Chris Chambers.
Right, thanks very much. Thanks to the BPS and Royal Society for putting on this great event. I was just thinking during Dorothy's talk that it's really easy, and we've had this discussion for decades now about what we should be doing in research to improve reproducibility and transparency, but there's not as much discussion about why we should do it and what's the benefit for the individual. And I think, as Marcus first pointed out, all of this stems from the fundamental rift in the incentive structures in science. On the one hand, we all know, everyone in this room and everyone everyone who's ever done science knows that what's best for science is high-quality research that's made public and is made as transparent as possible, regardless of the outcome. But what's best for you as an individual scientist is to produce a lot of publishable results. And until we figure out a way to realign this incentive structure so that what is good for you as an individual is also good for the community, the individual always wins. We can stand here for 100 years and say, you should pre-register, you should share data, you should do this, you should do that. But no one's going to do it unless there's a good reason to do it. And that's been my focus for the last few years, to try and develop an approach, a procedure, a philosophy that brings these together. Now we know that, and I don't need to rehash this, but we know that if you put researchers under pressure to get publishable results, they will produce them. They may not be true, they may not be reliable, they may not be reproducible, but you will get all these positive results. And so you end up with this litany of failures in the scientific method: publication bias, p-hacking, retrofitting hypothesis, lack of sharing of data, low power, and lack of replication. These are now standard features in psychology and in other sciences. That is uncontroversial. And they conspire to short-circuit our scientific method that we teach. We know that the scientific method doesn't work quite like this. It's not a perfect deductive cycle like this. But this is what we teach. This is what our statistical methods are predicated upon. And we know that these problems conspire to undermine that methodology at every stage. And we need to work very hard to correct and reinforce the model at each of those stages. So why is this happening? Well, it's happening for, I think, a very simple reason, which is that we place far too much importance on the results of experiments and research projects and not enough emphasis on the processes that produce them. And that's because we're humans, and this is human nature. Results make science exciting. We wouldn't be doing science if we didn't find results captivating. That's what keeps us coming back. That's why we want answers to questions. But the minute we start judging the quality of science according to the results and deciding what should be seen in the public domain according to results, and the minute we start judging scientists themselves according to their results, then we are soft science. We have fallen. And that is the problem that we need to solve. And we can solve it by adopting quite a simple philosophy, that when it comes to hypothesis testing, what gives a piece of scientific research its value is the question that it asks and the quality and robustness and the rigor of the method that it uses, and never, ever the result it produces. And this leads you to it led me to an interesting conclusion, which is that if you believe this to be true, then in fact we're doing publishing all wrong. We in fact should be making editorial decisions at journals in such a way that the decision maker is blind to those results, because the results can only bias you. They're not something that should inform your judgment about whether a piece of science is publishable or not. Now that's all well and good in theory, so how can we make this happen in practice? And this is where registered reports comes in. So we set up registered reports 3 years ago in the journal Cortex, and the idea was to try and incentivize a more radical, different way of thinking about publishing. There are 4 key features. The first is that researchers decide their hypotheses, their procedures, their main analyses before they embark on data collection. Part of the peer review process takes place before the experiments are conducted, so that protocol is peer reviewed. Passing that stage of peer review virtually guarantees publication if you follow through with your protocol. And original studies and high-value replications are welcomed as part of this initiative. So how does it work in practice? So what will happen is an author will submit what we call a stage 1 manuscript, which will include an introduction, proposed methodology, analyses, and any pilot data as applicable, for instance, if they want to validate a methodology or a power analysis. This then goes out to peer review after a triage process, and reviewers are asking the following questions. Are the hypotheses well-founded? Is there a strong rationale for asking this question and making that particular prediction? Are the methods feasible? Is the methodological detail in that protocol sufficient that an independent expert or specialist in that field could replicate that particular result? Is the study well-powered? And we set a threshold of more than 90% at Cortex. Different journals set different degrees of power that they require. And have the authors included sufficient conditions in their experiments that they can confirm that their study will provide a fair test? So what we would conventionally think of as positive controls, manipulation checks, things that we teach in psychology, in first-year psychology, in fact, but which we often miss when we're designing our own research experiments. Now, if the reviews at this stage are positive, then the journal issues what's called an in-principle acceptance, a provisional acceptance regardless of the study outcome, and the protocol at this point is not published. It's held in reserve by the journal. The authors go away and do their research, and then once they've conducted their study, collected their data, and analysed their data according to their protocol, then they can resubmit what we call a Stage 2 manuscript, which includes the introduction and method from their first Stage 1 submission, which is virtually unchanged except for changes in tense, obviously between future and past, and a results section, which is divided into two distinct kind of sections. One is the outcome of the registered confirmatory analyses. So these are the outcomes of the analyses that you said you would do. And the other part is any unregistered exploratory analyses, transparently identified, but of course open to the freedom of the investigator to pursue, where you can report anything that you thought up along the way, and there can be very good reasons for doing exploratory analyses. But the most important thing and the most defining feature of this model is that they are clearly distinguished in a way that is not true for standard research reports. The manuscripts include a discussion, and then as a standard part of the process, data are deposited in a public archive so that other researchers can use that data, analyse that data, perform their own analyses on that data, and so on. It can be a useful public resource. This goes out to Stage 2 review, where reviewers are now performing a very simple process. Did the authors follow the protocol? Did the positive controls and manipulation checks that were pre-registered as a way of safeguarding the quality of the study, did they succeed as expected? And are the conclusions that the authors propose justified by the data that they present? And if that all checks out, then the manuscript is published. None of these things matters. It's really important to emphasize, and this is, I think, really the main selling point of this format. It doesn't matter whether the hypothesis was supported or not, which means there can be no publication bias, because the decision to publish or not is never based upon the outcome of the primary hypothesis testing. Therefore, it doesn't matter whether your P is less than 0.05. It doesn't matter whether your results are novel, potentially one of the most pernicious criteria, I think, that we see in journal policies. And equally, it doesn't matter whether your results are considered to have impact. It doesn't matter what reviewers think of your results as being interesting or not, whether they think they're a substantial advance or not. Those are irrelevant considerations. Here's just a few examples of registered reports that have appeared at Cortex recently. And the paper that appears looks like a standard paper. Because the protocol is held in reserve by the journal until the final stage of peer review, the whole thing is published at the end, and it has a standard introduction, method, results, discussion format, and it looks and feels like very much like a normal paper, except that you as a reader and as a critical reviewer after the fact can be assured that the hypothesis wasn't changed, that the confirmatory analyses are reported, and that exploratory analyses are transparently reported. So I just want to anticipate a few questions. We get this when this was started. It generated a lot of discussion, and a lot of I've had over the years many questions about this particular process, and I'm just going to highlight a few of the major frequently asked questions that we get. The first is this format suitable for all sciences, and of course including psychology? And the answer is, it depends. It depends on what you're doing. So it really is applicable in any area where you're engaging in a priori, deductive, hypothesis-driven research, where one or more of these problems that afflict us apply, various forms of bias, post hoc hypothesizing, and so on. This format of publication can help address those problems in any area. So it doesn't really matter whether it's psychology or biology or even some areas of physics. What's to stop researchers from pre-registering a study that they have already conducted? I love that this comes up so much. It shows how kind of willing we are to entertain the idea of gaming the system in quite extreme ways. That this can't be done with a registered report without committing fraud, because when authors submit their data files at stage 2, they're time-stamped, so to prove that the data was collected on a particular date. And authors must also certify when they're resubmitting that all data in their primary experiments was collected after and not before provisional acceptance of the protocol. So if you were prepared to therefore pre-register a study post hoc, you would be deliberately lying. And I think that's quite rare, and I don't think many of us would consider taking it such an extreme path. And if we were, we wouldn't bother going through a registered report anyway. We would just make up the data and send it to Nature. In any case, imagine if you weren't prepared to go that far, but you were prepared to just have a punt, to run a study, get a result, and then send your protocol in and attempt to pre-register it after the fact. You'd find that would backfire anyway, because reviewers almost always ask you to amend the procedures, and unless you have a time machine, you can't change a procedure you've already conducted. However, all of those things being the case, it's important to emphasize that this format of publication is not a fraud prevention tool. That's not something it was ever designed to be. It's instead a mechanism for incentivizing what we would all consider to be best practice when we're engaged in hypothesis-driven deductive science. What's to stop registered reports from becoming a dumping ground for inconclusive results? These are actual questions I've had in the past. A fair point, because if you were to imagine this format being applied in the current climate, you would see a lot of inconclusive results both ways because of the low power that we know about in the psychological literature that we've known about for many, many years. However, for registered reports, the a priori power requirements help overcome this problem, so requiring high power increases the evidential value of both positive and negative findings. And also, I think it's important that we start to embrace methods which are in fact older, but have only been adopted more recently, the Bayesian inferential hypothesis testing approaches, which can, unlike frequentist tests, provide positive evidence of absence rather than being limited to concluding absence of evidence. And when you put these two things together, you end up with quite a powerful way of ensuring that whatever is published, regardless of the outcome, will provide an informative contribution to the literature. Will this limit exploration or stigmatize exploratory research? It's often said when people say the word pre-registration, the automatic response you get from people is, oh, what about exploratory science? What about serendipity? This is going to tie my hands. This is going to limit my ability to be a creative genius. This is not the case. In fact, with registered reports, there are no restrictions on being creative and doing exploratory analyses and unregistered exploratory analyses. The only thing is that they are transparently reported as such, which helps everyone. It helps us as investigators avoid Richard Feynman's famous quote of fooling ourselves. It avoids us fooling each other, and it helps improve the reproducibility of the area. We launched this in 2013, as I mentioned, in Cortex, and at the time, we felt that it would be worth raising the public profile of this initiative. So we convinced around 80 senior scientists and members of journal editorial boards to sign a letter with us calling for this format to be offered throughout the life sciences and indeed social sciences. And encouragingly, in those 3 years, we've seen now the format approved or launched at 26 journals, the most recent just being a few days ago. And there's something interesting about this, which is that even though most of us who have promoted this format have done so from the platform of psychology, it's been picked up in some interesting areas. So you can see here not just psychology journals, but psychiatry. There's a special issue in eLife on cancer biology. We're seeing Journal of Accounting Research. This is fascinating. I didn't even know this was an area of investigation. But there's an area called empirical accounting, which performs hypothesis tests on financial records extracted from companies. And they do basically the same thing we do with a completely different sampling approach and a different set of questions. And registered reports is gaining traction there. We're seeing it in areas of political science and more sort of organizational and media psychology. And one that I want to pick up on is, given this where we are standing today, is at a journal called Royal Society Open Science, where we launched registered reports in November 2015. And the nice thing, the unique thing about here is that this journal publishes science across more than 200 different specializations. And what we've done is we've launched it across all those areas. So it doesn't matter whether you're a psychologist or a chemist, physicist, biologist, it doesn't matter. This format is now available to you as a researcher. So this is going to be a very interesting litmus test for the traction and the need for this format in these different areas. And if you navigate to the RSOS page, you can find more details on that particular format. In addition, for those so interested, we've set up an information hub on the Open Science Framework where we provide a long list of frequently asked questions about this format. I think there's over 30 now. It tends to grow, but it's sort of plateaued at the moment. We haven't had a new question for some time. But it also lists all of the journals that are currently offering the format. It links to the author guidelines for those specific journals. It provides resources for editors. So if there's any journal editors in the room who are interested in adopting this format, it provides a lot of materials. For instance, cover letters that you can send to reviewers, template decision letters. And it also provides a description of the process and how it applies in different contexts. So if this web link here is a bit obscure, but if you just Google registered reports, it comes up as the top hit. Now, as we look forward and look ahead in the coming months, we're going to see this format go even further. So we're going to see it offered by more prominent journals over the next 12 months. And we're also going to see a new form of registered reports spring up in partnership between journals and funders, where the stage 1 protocol that is submitted to a journal is actually very similar to a grant application in many ways. It's just a very specific, very precise grant application. So it would be very interesting, wouldn't it, to try a format of registered report where the journal and the funder simultaneously review a protocol and the decision to publish is made at the same time and by the same group of people as the decision to award funding. And that's something that we're in very positive discussions with a number of journals and funders. So that's something that could quite radically change the landscape because it shifts some funding out of the traditional pot where the emphasis is on novelty, innovation, risk-taking and creativity and moves it into an area where those things aren't completely nullified, but issues of transparency, reproducibility and rigor are raised to the same level. So I'll leave it at that. Thanks for your time and do come and chat with any of us afterward if you want to hear more about this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris, for another truly stimulating talk and providing some solutions for us and things for us to think about. Remarkably, we are 1 minute ahead of time. This fills me with a lot of joy. Those who know me will understand that I like things to be on time. So well done us, and well done to our excellent speakers. So thank you so much for your live tweeting. Thank you for your Slido engagement. It is now time to enjoy some coffee. And then please, please, please return after the coffee break for more excellent talks. And then really what I hope will be the highlight, which will be the panel discussion. Thank you very much to all our speakers so far. Welcome back. It's great to see still lots of people who've returned and are still here for the second half. So we really have a very exciting afternoon program. So as I say, we've got 3 more presentations followed by a panel discussion. So before I introduce Catherine Sharples, who's going to be speaking to us first, I think it's important to note that we are having a real impact today already. So on social media, we are in the top 20 of all worldwide trending topics. You know, that's big. We're having big impact. Brian Nosak has retweeted this event. And indeed, there's a very similar event happening currently in Chicago. Little did we realize that we were that good at timing. We've got these events coinciding. We did plan that, but let's not worry about that too much. So, can I now welcome Catherine Sharples. Catherine is going to present something very different now. It's again about solutions. Catherine is from Wiley, and she is the Associate Director for Editorial Development. And we're hopefully going to hear about the kind of exciting new advances at Wiley as a leading publisher and also the publisher of the British Psychological Society's journals. We're going to hear about the work they're doing and how we might help improve replication and reproducibility. So can you put your hands together, please, for Catherine Sharples.
Thanks, Darryl. Thanks for inviting me here today. It's quite exciting to be giving a talk at the Royal Society. I'm afraid my presentation does not contain any p-values. So I'm going to talk about open science and reproducibility in the context of open science. And they're clearly areas where there's a huge amount of growing interest on the part of researchers, but also on the part of the societies who support them. And those two areas are a focus of funders and governments worldwide. It's a pretty fast-moving and fairly complex environment. Approaches to aspects of open science and particular open access vary around the world, and sometimes it can seem a little bit like there are new policies and new initiatives developing every day. It can be hard to keep up with. In Europe alone, there are currently over 450 open access policies in place. At the beginning of the year, that number was closer to 400. So I'm going to talk a bit about a publisher's approach to open science. And I thought I would start by giving a kind of definition of open science. This one from the European Commission is quite a nice one. The key elements are highlighted in red. Science is becoming more open, accessible, efficient, democratic, and transparent, driven by new digital tools, making scientific knowledge more easily accessible everywhere. I believe open science represents an opportunity for funders, for institutions, for societies, and for publishers to work together in support of researchers and their scientific endeavours in ways to help increase their pace of discovery. So before I talk about the things that we, Wiley, are doing in this space, I'll give a bit of an overview of some of the important drivers behind this move towards open science, or the kind of buzz around open science. Technology is a very significant, probably the primary driver here. There are fewer, arguably now no barriers to working openly. New technologies with greater capabilities are providing innovative new ways to share larger and larger amounts of data, to collaborate more easily and to verify results. Researcher behaviours are changing. Particularly early career researchers are increasingly looking for new ways to disseminate their work, but also to get credit for the full range of work that they're doing. Not just the publication of papers, but the reviewing of papers and the collection and sharing of data associated with their work. They're looking for new ways to collaborate and new ways to find new collaborators. There's a growing pressure to allow others to do what open source developers have been doing for quite a while, and that's to build on the existing research of others more quickly. Researchers are recognising, admittedly at different paces in different subject areas, that the benefits of working openly can far outweigh the perceived risks. This has been touched on already in a couple of presentations earlier. Changes or the increasing frustration at the closed nature of the traditional peer review model. The idea of the waste caused by having to repeat the peer review process for each new journal submission. The lack of transparency and accountability in the closed peer review system. And the fact that reviewers aren't normally recognised or rewarded for the time and effort that they put into peer review. This is actually a fairly contentious area of openness, and it might be quite valuable to have a discussion about this later on, perhaps in the panel session. Possibly two of the next speakers are going to touch on this topic too. The wider public are looking for better, faster responses to global challenges. They're becoming increasingly vocal, helped by some of our interesting news outlets, about the benefits of having access to research that's been funded by public money. There's a potential advantage here to increasing the public trust in research when a paper, its data, and the other artefacts associated it can be made more accessible and can be opened up at the time of a press release, for example. Changes in research assessment metrics, another area that's been touched on by some of our earlier speakers. This drive to demonstrate the economic and societal impact of research, the emergence of alternative metrics which are encouraging a move towards increased openness. In my opinion, changes in the research assessment by funders and by institutions are going to be really strong drivers towards a more open future. Researchers are always going to, or if they're sensible, will always want to do what their funders require of them. So this is a very important and, again, possibly contentious area. Funders want greater and faster returns on their investment. So do governments. They want to spur innovation and economic development. And they both want better ways of tracking the output of their funding, ways of measuring the impact of the funding that they've devoted. They want to be able to answer questions such as, what has this funding produced? How easily accessible is the work that we've funded? And what kind of career trajectory have we helped you to take, you as the researcher? And finally, the topic of much discussion here today, reproducibility. The NOSEC paper was clearly a cause of much discussion within your subject community, but other disciplines, as alluded to earlier, have shared the same issues. The quote on this slide here comes from a 2012 Nature paper by the authors Glenn Begley and Lee Ellis, who found that they could successfully replicate the scientific experiments used to support just 11% of so-called landmark biomedical research papers published in high-profile journals. Last year, in an interview with the EU's Horizon magazine, Philip Campbell, the editor-in-chief of Nature, was asked if he thought that this was the fault of the peer review process. His response was, a researcher might have mistakenly done something in the lab, subconsciously picked the best data to show, or even consciously picked the best data to show. All of these things happen, and you can't simply pick that up when you're looking at the paper. A referee has a day at most. All they can do is take on trust what the paper says. So if there's stuff going on in the background in terms of errors behind the data, it's hard for the referee to pick that up. Whether you agree or not with his response, it points to the fact that reproducibility is a pretty thorny issue, as I think we've already heard in the earlier presentations. It's not something that can be addressed simply by the peer review process. It can imply a level of transparency, a level of detail and perfection that is maybe unachievable, but it can also be taken to mean generally that the data analysis and the conclusions drawn from a research paper can be verified, not that the study itself can or has been replicated. Making analytic data and analytic code available, providing good documentation of both that code and the data, preferably to community-accepted standards, and providing standard or openly enabled means of distributing that code and data is really key. Societies, institutions, funders, and publishers all have a role to play in normalising the practices required to address the drive towards reproducibility. Some of those practices that Marcus talked about in his talk earlier on. So, what are the benefits of this drive towards openness? Well, increased openness is about making scientific research more open, transparent, accessible for researchers, for stakeholders, and for the general public alike. It's also about increased reproducibility, creating more efficient and a more effective landscape, whether that's for those conducting, funding, or supporting research. And it's about increased accountability, protecting the integrity and the overall reputation of research and the researcher. Together, these benefits can be summarised in the view that open science leads to a higher return on investment and a faster pace of discovery. But this overarching benefit supports the goals of the different members of the research community, funders, institutions, societies, and researchers. Funders, after all, want the research that they fund to solve the biggest problems of our time, and they want to think that that's what they're doing. Institutions want to educate citizens and future leaders of our societies. Societies want to advance the understanding and the utility of their discipline. And researchers, well, they want to disseminate their findings quickly, to collaborate quickly and easily with people in relevant adjacent fields, and for their research outputs to help them advance in their careers. Open science supports all of these goals, making each of these constituents, or helping to make each of these constituents more successful in the things that they do. So what are publishers doing in this space? Well, at Wiley, we've organised the ways in which we support developments in open science around these 5 pillars. Open access, about facilitating faster and greater access to publicly funded research. Open data, about encompassing data archiving, about the ways that we facilitate the collection of data and link it to the article and the methodology used. Standards, about the ways that we embrace collaborative, interoperable and global dissemination standards. I think there's a paucity of standards in many areas, and there's actually a real potential, in my view, for societies and for subject communities to play a really important role in setting the standards for their disciplines and then working with others, with funders and with publishers to really kind of embed those standards and ensure that researchers and authors adhere to them. Open collaboration is about our support for more inclusive and networked research practice, and open recognition and reward, about helping the integration of researcher identification and using evaluation tools in the publishing workflow. We work with a number of different partners to develop services and tools to address each of these 5 pillars, and you can see some of them in the circles at the bottom of this slide. As we embrace the open science movement as publishers, our goal is focused on facilitating faster and more effective research discovery. I should also say, because we're a commercial publisher, we support the open science movement, but it doesn't mean that we believe everything has to be open. The benefits of open science support, drive, and align with our existing subscription-based journals model. We're in a hotbed of gold open access here in the UK and more widely in Europe, but that's not true in every other part of the world. Subscription journals can and do contribute heavily, for example, to the opening up of access to underlying data. And the hybrid subscription model, whilst often criticised, offers authors the opportunity to publish their work openly in some of the established community-leading journals that they respect and want to publish in. So let's take a quick look at each of the 5 pillars. I'll start with open access because that's probably the most familiar to everybody and the most established. Wiley's developed a very strong mixed programme of open access journals consisting of subscription or hybrid journals that offer the gold option and more than 60 fully open access titles, some of which we've established with society partners. We've also developed tools to help authors to understand the open access landscape. As I alluded to earlier, it can be pretty tricky to navigate at times. We've produced things like roadmaps to help understand the difference between the gold and green route and tools to make it easier for authors to ensure that they're complying with the relevant mandate. We've worked closely with funders and with institutions to set up open access accounts that allow funders to easily pay the APCs for their authors. And once their papers have been accepted, authors can simply select the funder when ordering their payment. Payments automatically taken from the account. Librarians can now monitor and manage their APC funds accordingly, and they've provided us with really great feedback as to how well this is working. We have self-archiving policies for all of our journals in place, allowing authors to archive the submitted versions of their articles on their own websites, in their institutional repositories, or in their subject repository immediately with no embargo. And the accepted version of the article can be deposited or can be archived after 12 months or 24 months for some disciplines. Open data. This is a pillar of open science that's been attracting much more attention recently. Funders are increasingly requiring grantees to deposit raw research data in the appropriate repositories. Welcome, the ESRC, the Royal Society and the MRC, for instance, all currently require data archiving. So to support greater research transparency and visibility, we're introducing journal policies around data sharing and citations, broadly aligned with the TOPS guidelines. Having a policy in place is the first step to data sharing, but we also know that we need to make it easy for authors to comply with those policies. So we're working on ways to help authors transfer or link to approved repositories to comply with their mandates. We've been working with Figshare on a pilot of a data repository integration project. allowing authors to deposit their data via the ScholarOne editorial office system so that it can be available to reviewers during the review process. And once the paper is accepted, we export that data to Figshare, where it receives a DOI, and we make the link back from the data in Figshare to the article published on online library. We have a number of ecology journals that work with Dryad rather than Figshare, and this has given us actually a really nice example of how effective journal data policies can be. In one of our molecular ecology journals, we've seen over 1,000 data packages deposited into the public domain in only 3 years. We also believe it's important to support industry initiatives around the protection of data sharing. So we're signatories of the TOPS guidelines of Consort, Equator, and the FAIR initiatives. In the open standard space, we're doing some work which is kind of a little bit further away from fruition, but it should yield some very interesting results in the next few months and year. Scholarly articles are typically encoded in an unstructured way, and we're now embracing open web standards such as scholarly HTML in order to invest in a digital-first infrastructure which will enable our authors to publish their journal articles in an integrated way, along with the text, the images, the data, and the code associated with their paper. This will help us preserve more of the research activities as part of the whole scientific record, helping researchers to find their work or find the work of others when and where they need it most. In the collaboration space, we're investing in technologies to support a more inclusive and networked approach to collaboration, exploring the ways in which annotation tools and collaborative writing tools such as Overleaf can help authors to maximise their time and budgets and avoid redoing their formatting work. And lastly, in the open recognition and reward space, we're developing new partnerships and programs to address the need for new forms of recognition and reward. Author recognition starts with author disambiguation, which of course means ORCID. While the authors can create an ORCID ID during the submission process, it takes a couple of minutes and it's a fairly painless experience. Once the paper's been accepted, the ORCID ID travels with the paper. It's displayed next to the paper in its published form on online library, and it's submitted to Crossref so that it can be exported to the author's own ORCID record. Post-publication, we work with QDOS and Altmetrics in order to help monitor and measure the impact of published research so that authors can see not just the citation impact of their research, but also the social media and usage activity. Earlier this week, we announced a pilot with QDOS to help societies track and improve the impact, track the impact of the work of their membership, and we're participating with QDOS on that project over the next few months. To help address the issues mentioned earlier on today around recognition and peer review, we've partnered with Publons. Publons works with researchers and publishers to give credit or to create credit in peer review, to turn peer review into a measurable research output. It creates comprehensive reviewer profiles with a publisher-verified review that can be included in promotion or funding applications. A further integration of Publons will allow reviewer activities to be linked with ORCID IDs. And our partnership with Publons demonstrates our commitment to innovate in the areas of peer review and experiment with new approaches, working towards new forms of recognition for the contributions that researchers make to the advancement of science. So that was a bit of a whistle-stop tour of open science from a Wiley perspective. I think you can see that open science is evolving and that new ways of supporting the open science agenda continue to emerge. I think it represents a really important opportunity, as I said earlier, for publishers, for funders, for institutions, and for societies to work together to facilitate faster and more effective research discovery. Thank you.
Many thanks, Catherine, for which was a very different talk, and it's nice to hear the details, the precise details of what Wiley are doing in order to try and support replication and psychological science more generally. And I'm pretty certain, based on the Twitter feed, there's going to be a number of questions for colleagues at Wiley about that whole dynamic. Is Charlotte Hartwright here? Well done, Charlotte. You are currently leading the poll on Slido. Did I mention Slido? Please, can you go back to Slido if you haven't looked at it again, because now we're getting towards the end of the day where we want to find out which questions are most popular with you guys. So Charlotte is currently at the top of the poll, and I can tell this has made your day, and if not, your week, and maybe even your year. So well done, Charlotte. So let's move on now to our penultimate talk, and I genuinely am very excited to hear from Nick Brown. Nick is going to talk to us about something very different. He's going to talk about the incentive structure, or as we called it at one other time, the inventive structure. But certainly here, we are going to hear, I think, a very different take on things. So please, can you put your hands together to welcome Nick Brown from Groningen.
Hello. Some of you may have seen earlier versions of the program today that described me as Professor Nick Brown. I'm not a professor. I don't have a PhD. Until 5 years ago, I thought Hanover was a town in Germany you could fly to from Southend. I am a retired international civil servant. I took a master's at the University of East London. I'm currently a PhD candidate at the University of Groningen. My supervisor is James C. Coyne, a name that may not be entirely without controversy in this room, but he is not here today, although I'm sure he'll be watching the video. I spent 31 years working in IT, in management, in human resources, outside of academia. I have a lot of experience of how bureaucracies really work and how people really behave in them. So that has been my sort of intellectual baggage as I've entered this funny little world. So what do you require to be an outsider? I think you need three things. I think you have to be able to demonstrate that you're not part of the problems of the past, that you don't need to be part of the future, and I'm not looking for a job, and that you're competent in the present, and that is always my struggle. There is a very fine line between the plucky amateur researcher and the crank, and sometimes I'm sitting in front of the latest article in well, you can think of the journal, and I'm, no, don't be the crank. Make sure you understand this. And there's times when I don't understand it. There's times when I have to go and find out what that statistical technique is that I don't know about. But I would maybe have an instinct that there's something wrong. So why am I invited here? A couple of Twitter pals, I think, put my name forward to be here today. This was my first ever article before I actually got my master's degree. It caused a little bit of trouble back in 2013 when we rebutted something called the positivity ratio. You may remember it. If not, go off and Google it. This is your emotions or something when something else happens. It has 1,000 citations, and it's utter nonsense. Another contribution that my co-authors at that time, Sokal and Friedman, told me not to do, but has been one of the best things I've ever done. Put your hand up if you recognize this person. All right, so this is everybody's favorite social psychologist, Dietrich Stapel, who wrote during the year between when he was caught and fired and the Commission of Inquiry reported on his fraud, wrote this book, which is it's actually a extremely good book to read, interesting book to read, not just from the point of view of the lessons in it for science, but also the writing style. It turns out that one of my obscure skills is that I am fluent in Dutch, and so I translated this book into English. It is available for free download from here, but don't worry too much about writing that down. If you go on Twitter and contact me, I will send it you, and in any case, I'll be putting these slides up at the end of the day. I presume Darryl will be putting everyone's slides up at the end of the day. So I translated this book into English. It's a mixture of autobiography and confessional and how he did it, some of which may not be completely accurate, I don't know, but there's some very, very interesting stuff in there. And I think anyone who works in psychology probably ought to read this book, and it's a free Creative Commons download, so I don't make any money out of this. Which we'll be coming to in a minute. So there are some general incentive problems in science, and I've been sitting for the first 3 or 4 talks today while particularly Chris and Marcus, have been going, incentive problem. I go, yeah, don't give away all my slides. So let's go through very, very quickly funding, promotions, tenure, power, prestige, excellence. I was slightly reticent to leave that on because the BPS's own logo has creating excellence in psychology on it. But, you know, we all have to put up with excellence. Really. And occasionally we get some science done. So, you know, what are the things enabling bad science? Again, we've heard that earlier, and I'm going to assume that you absorbed everything from the previous talks you already knew. So we have publication bias. Peer review is a lottery. I get asked to review papers. That's how much of a lottery it is. Journals are chasing after impact factor, and you wouldn't know I'd been your reviewer. Journals are chasing after impact factor. Open access journals are chasing after money, and maybe come and talk to me about that at the drink afterwards, but I'm quite a skeptic of open access publishing. The publish or perish culture. I found this lovely quote the other day from this article which described the concept of an article publication commune. I don't know if you've ever heard of that, but essentially what that means is that Dorothy and Marcus and Chris and I will agree that whenever Chris writes an article, he'll put us on as authors, and whenever Marcus writes it, he'll put us on as authors, and we've just quadrupled our productivity. And really, if that isn't something we can all be proud of and write to the minister about, I don't know what is. Journals are unwilling to publish comments. That's a nice little reference. The author had some of his science criticised by or in a rebuttal article in which, apart from anything else, the authors made an error of calculation by an order of magnitude. Something was off by a factor of 1,000. And the article that links to is called How to Publish a Scientific Comment in 1, 2, 3 Easy Steps, where 1, 2, 3 is in fact the number 123. And he recounts how over 18 months the business that he had built on the back of this science collapsed while he failed to get this comment published. And yeah, there really ought to be kind of a horizontal line here that says total, most published research results are false. Probably 70, 80, 90% in the biomedical are just false. We kind of know this. This is the background. If you don't know that yet, this is the starting point. We then have some problems that are more or less specific to psychology. First of all, it sells. Everybody likes stories about themselves. Popular media love those kind of man bites dog stories. If they're counterintuitive, if they're about love, etc. Scientists are shining. You know the stuff. You know the outlets we're talking about here. Psychologists, unlike peptide synthesizers, can derive personal fame and fortune from their research. In the last week, there have been reports in the press of 2 American authors of popular books based on psychology swinging through London on their book tour. The leading researchers in positive psychology will come and give a 1.25-hour talk at your company for somewhere in the region of $30,000, plus in some cases 5 first-class return air tickets for all the members of their family. Conflict of interest codes don't seem to cover this. If I get funding off a drug company for my study, I have to declare it. But if I'm turning my research regularly and I'm into a series of successful books, I don't have to declare that industry. I don't know why. Fundamental problem of the science. There is no proof by technology. If I claim to have made a better transistor, somebody's going to say, okay, make me a smaller phone, make me a more powerful phone. At some point, science gets turned into technology, and that's how everyone knows it works, not just the scientists. There cannot be a proof by technology, I would argue, in psychology. It's a limitation of the field. The constructs we measure are not externally verifiable. Very often, all of the constructs in a study are all being defined by the same person. We have very little solid theory. Everything in its opposite can be true simultaneously. This town is plenty big of us for both of us. There seems to be, to me, again, as an outsider, a tacit agreement in psychology that Chris is not going to tell Marcus what a load of crap his theory is, as long as Marcus doesn't publish anything saying what a load of crap Chris's theory is. There is no testing of theory. There is no debate about theory. We don't critically discuss the relative merits of theories very often, because there's plenty of room for everybody. In the literature, anyway. The bar at the conference is always a little bit different. A lot of psychologists run a mile when statistics have to be done. There's somebody down the corridor who does it for us. Maybe we explain all of the constraints of our study to them. Maybe they understand it. Most psychologists do not know how to interpret p-values correctly. If you read this study, they put a test in front of a definition of a result based on p-values in front of a number of undergraduates, graduate students, research psychologists, and people who taught statistics courses. The best success rate in terms of correctly answering the question was 20% among the people teaching the statistics courses. 80% of them got it wrong. And it was worse among the other research groups. My personal observation, many psychologists consider numbers a necessary evil. We want to get to the good stuff. We want to get to helping people. We want to get to knowing what's good. That's great, but the numbers are not optional. And they will often tell you the opposite of what you wanted to hear, and you have to listen to them. So the net result of all that is right here in this month's edition of The Psychologist. So I'm pleased to say it's not just me standing here causing trouble. The BPS's own magazine agrees with me. So, what are the consequences of these bad incentives? We've heard some of them already. Harking, hypothesizing after the results are known, type 1 error, questionable research practices, and the F word. And the F word is going to feature a little bit from the rest of this talk. Outright fraud. It happens. It happens probably more than we want to think. And it's the elephant in the room here. It needs to be addressed. A quote from Starple. When he was... In the book, he's about to fake his first data, having exhausted all of his other questionable research practices. How else did these other researchers get all these great results? This is a quote from an ethnographic study published earlier this year in I think they were doing research on infants. And this is one of the grad students. We have a bunch of half-baked ideas, we run a bunch of experiments, whatever data we get, we pretend that's what we were looking for. They've got a machine to generate significant results and then make up some theory around them. Type 1 error is really no big deal. If I can paraphrase Peter Mandelson, the Labour politician, psychologists appear to me to be intensely relaxed about the prospect of type 1 error. Type 1 error is not a career-limiting problem. If you go to other sciences, it can get you into trouble. Fleischmann and Pons made a pretty big type 1 error with cold fusion, and we haven't heard a lot of them since. Benveniste made a pretty enormous type 1 error, claiming that Memorder had memory, and we haven't heard a lot from him since, or we didn't hear a lot more from him until he died. Reasons. Well, first of all, let's face it, very few people are going to take what any of us do here. I don't do empirical research. No one's going to take this and going to be flying a plane with it in 3 months' time. We kind of know in our hearts that this is not going to be taken straight out there and put in front, and it's not even going to be injected into anybody. And this is quite a difficult question, but I think there is a kind of psychological issue here that we know this is not going to be immediately. It's important stuff. It's a brick in the wall, but it doesn't really matter if we get this wrong. Replication attempts have historically been unlikely, so the chance anyone would discover your type 1 error were pretty small. And, if anyone does show that your research isn't reproducible, you can bring on unlimited post-hoc hidden moderators. I shouldn't really have used that quote there because I don't think Miel said hidden moderators, but that's the reference for how people explain away all their failures. Here's an example of hidden moderators from an article where students were primed with images of money and then behaved badly in various ways. So we ran the study, the authors ran the study on 100 students, they got a significant result, they wrote it up. The discussion section, the press release, the articles in the papers all said, people do this. When you make them think about money, they are selfish or whatever it is that they did. Somebody comes along and does a replication with 3 times the sample size, and the original author's result was, well, your undergraduates are different to our undergraduates because we're at the University of Chicago. The University of Chicago has a very strong tradition in business studies. None of the students were actually business studies students. And therefore, our undergraduates at the University of Chicago are much more susceptible to being manipulated by thoughts about money. Well, then, why didn't they put that in the discussion section? So it's very easy to take a punt on everybody's like this, and then when the result doesn't replicate, oh, well, we didn't really mean that. Okay. There are no disincentives for questionable research practices. The majority of psychologists admit to using questionable research practices at some time or another. In some cases, editors and reviewers ask for them to improve articles. And some senior people have recently admitted leaving non-significant results out of their studies. It seems to be necessary to cheat to compete, which is what they say in cycling, where they're putting motors in the bikes and whatever. This is Yuri Simonson, the Wharton Business School at Pennsylvania. And this is an interview he gave earlier this year. And he was asked, absolutely up front, what percentage of articles do you think contain fraudulent data? Yuri estimates it at 5%, and he's uncovered several fraudsters over time. I think it's higher than that. I think that may well be higher than that. There are minimal disincentives for fraud. We have no police. We only have vigilantes. Imagine a society out there, no police, no public prosecutor. The judges' ad hoc committee of your peers called in to save the university from embarrassment. A standard of proof that is way higher than in death penalty cases. Higher punishments for pleading guilty. Starple pled guilty. He's been completely ostracized. Various other recent people have been thrown out, but they come back. They're on the periphery of academia. We're probably only catching the most incompetent fraudsters, the ones who aren't so good at covering their tracks. This is an article I got in preprint as of 2 days ago. It has 200 downloads. We took 260 articles from leading journals. We checked the summary statistics, means mostly. In half the cases we were able to check, at least one of the means was not compatible with the sample size. We requested data from 21 of these articles. 9 people sent us their data, the other 12 either refused or just stopped talking to us. All of the 9 we looked at had genuine reporting errors. 2 of them were catastrophic for the article, which will lead in one case a correction, in another case probably to be retracted. 2 teams refused, and we know there's a known perpetrator of fraud on the article as an author. 2 other independent teams sent us identically worded refusals, 120 words long, as if a lawyer had written it. Here's an example. This is a paper from the 1990s. That table contains 50 means and 50 standard deviations. 17 of the means are not compatible with the sample sizes. And this article has had trouble being reproduced. We are running out of parsimonious explanations. Maybe one reason we can't reproduce some of our results is because they were either incorrectly reported or made up in the first place. That said, here is Starple. He made up some research, and he would find people would write to him and tell him about their successful replications of it. So, why won't researchers share data? I don't know. A lot of people have tried. The most common response is just not answering. When someone writes to you about your article, you don't reply. What? It's not a problem for most data sets to share them. It's just an SPSS file. Send it. Let other people curate it. So I'm accelerating here because I'm running out of time. At the start, Darryl promised us a collegial, upbeat discussion. I've been a little bit downbeat, maybe. Why does this happen? Well, I like to say water flows downhill. If you want to move water, or change the shape of the hill. Don't push water up the hill. People follow incentives. Psychologists are rational people. Rational people will do what the system incentivizes them to do. If we have QRPs, it's because the system is set up to reward it. The upside of cheating is perceived as greater than the downside. We're not going to fix this because incentives will trump rules. People will game the system. Vested interest groups are good at that. In other words, the turkeys are not about to start voting for Christmas. I want to close with a thought on this. If any other field let's say that peptide synthesis was having a big problem with reproducibility and psychology wasn't, psychologists would be all over that problem. So if only we had a science that studied human behavior that could help us with this. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Nick. Nick's complaining that I didn't give him enough time. You know what? The word tough comes to mind, Nick. Anyway, Nick, thank you very much for a truly excellent and inspiring talk. I don't think in any way it was downbeat. I thought it was really actually very entertaining, but also raising some very important issues. The elephant in the room, I think, has been addressed. I've just been informed by Lisa that we are now second in the trending worldwide Twitter gig, all right? Work hard with one talk left, all right? Work hard. So, can I introduce our final presentation, which again, I hope is going to be offering something very different. We've got Pratik Bush, who's from Sense About Science. So, amazingly, Pratik has told me that minutes before the talk, his team had contacted him because they were fact-checking his talk and discovered an error. Now, that is what I call very impressive dedication to what is turning out to be a fantastic event. So please put your hands together for Pratik Bush.
Thank you, Darryl. That's entirely true. And I was going to kick off actually by saying now for something completely different, but we've just had something completely different. So something perhaps on a tangent and hopefully one that is just as valuable as Nick's entertaining contribution. Certainly a tangent. I want to talk about government research. The thing is, as researchers, all of us here who are, and I'm a recovering academic, not a peptide synthesizer myself, but a molecular biologist. As researchers, we recognise, don't we, that replication and reproducibility are the backbone, not just of psychology, but of science as a pursuit, right? I mean, I was taught right from a young age that whatever I found would simply not be valid if I couldn't tell others how I found it in a way that they could reproduce it. So it's an absolute fundamental principle in research. We have to be able to be transparent to be reproducible. Now, we've heard a lot today about what is being called a crisis in psychology, a crisis of reproducibility. We've heard equally, really excitingly, about potential remedies. Great to hear from Chris and others on what may be done. Some of those remedies, particularly those that centre around transparency, I would argue apply not just to psychology as a discipline, but to science as a pursuit beyond psychology. And it's beyond psychology, beyond science in a way that I want to talk about today. I want to talk about how greater transparency that you in psychology and the other disciplines are beginning to talk about can be a benefit for science itself, but for the use of evidence in society more broadly, particularly in policy making. You might be familiar with some of the arguments I'm going to make. I hope you already are, because largely because of a campaign I think that Sense About Science has been running for some time, which argues for greater transparency, specifically in the registration and reporting of all clinical trials. But I want to go beyond psychology, beyond clinical trials, and into, as I said, the world of government research. Will not be any surprise to you that government, of course, is a major player in the research ecosystem, but I'm not talking in what I'm about to present about the large amount of funding that government provides through HEFCE and the research councils. But government is a major player in generating research evidence by directly through the civil service conducting research or commissioning it through outside experts. And a large proportion of that government research is, of course, designed to inform public policy. But perhaps as a byproduct, it also informs what we know about how the world works. An argument we've heard lots of people elaborate is that any research, but government research in particular, I would say, can only really effectively do that, inform policy and inform how we know about what we know about the world, if it is out there in the open, if it's replicable, if it's open to scrutiny. And those sorts of issues are all the more important when we're talking about government-funded research, or rather you and I funded research, government research, after all, being paid for by the taxpayer. There's a public accountability kind of imperative on government to be open about the research that it does. So the question that Sense About Science some year and a half ago began to ask was how transparent government is about its own research. I'm going to now do something that is probably quite unscientific. I'm going to tell you some facts and statistics, amongst which was one that was fact-checked. And I'll then tell you how we came about these numbers. The government every year spends around £2.5 billion on policy research that's either done in-house by the civil service or commissioned through outside experts. But government itself does not know how many studies it has commissioned, or which of them have been published, and when. Take that in, I'll keep that up there. That's just the government as a whole doesn't know how much research it has done. But parts of government can tell you how much research they have done. Some departments, such as DEFRA or Department for International Development and a couple of others, do have themselves publicly searchable databases of research they have commissioned from outside experts. But government as a whole cannot tell you how much research is done because other departments do not have this sort of data of the research that they've done themselves. Again, for an audience of this sort, it wouldn't be surprising if I called that an inefficient and, more importantly, an unaccountable use of evidence. So I said I would go into how that number came about and tell you a little bit more about the work that we've been doing in this space. This is a primary finding from an inquiry we are going to publish next week. What I'm providing you is an exclusive preview of what's going to come next week in the publication of an inquiry that we've been doing into the delayed publication of government-commissioned research. We've been really fortunate that a former appeal court judge, Sir Stephen Sedley, a trustee of our charity, has been leading this inquiry, which we initiated as a response to media stories that we'd sort of picked up on in the last couple of years of government research, whether into food banks or drugs or the impact of immigration, government research being withheld. As a charity that's interested in an open and honest discussion about science in society, that kind of story is of concern to us, and so we wanted to inquire what actually went wrong in these cases, what happened, but also to try and put them into some kind of context about, well, how much research has government done and how much of it is therefore withheld. As I just mentioned, we couldn't answer that fundamental question about government research. So the central finding from our inquiry then is one, and I don't think it's too strong a word to use, is one of chaos at the heart of how government conducts research. Something else we did uncover during this inquiry is that government is, of course, under a huge amount of pressure from all sorts of different areas to align the publication of policy research with the policy announcement that's going to be made. It's one source of delayed publication, of course. And equally, there is pressure on parts of government to... sorry, not pressure. There's a misunderstanding within government of what peer review really actually means and what role it has to play in quality assuring research that government does. There are a number of reasons, some of them justifiable, some of them less so, why government research gets delayed. But as I say, the primary finding of this inquiry, which we'll publish next week, is that we simply cannot tell what's going on in terms of how much research is done, how much of it is published, and how much of it is published. Now, I've put at the bottom there the main recommendation to flow from our inquiry is that there ought to be a single research database that tells you what research government has done and when and where it is published. And I am really keen, especially given everything Chris has talked about in terms of pre-registering protocols and hypotheses, I'm really keen to pick that up later either in the panel discussion or in the drinks afterwards as to how the policy community can be more open with the public to say, we have a problem, we looked into this using these questions, these are the results we found, and then whatever the results were, you said the results ought not to drive publication, whatever the results were, our policy is this. What we're talking about really is the need for more transparency, not necessarily the need for more evidence-based policy. I want to change tack again a little bit, if I may, at the end, because I mentioned just at the beginning that government is a big player in a research ecosystem by generating a lot of research evidence. Of course, government uses a lot of research evidence from that it generates itself and from the outside world, perhaps not as much as we would like, but that's another discussion. Government uses evidence to make policy. But how transparent is government in making policy? If a white paper is announced or a policy is made, where are the footnotes? It's a simple question. What evidence has been considered in producing a policy? That's the sort of question that Sense About Science, together with guys across the street there at the Institute for Government and colleagues at the Alliance for Useful Evidence, started to look into. And we came up with a framework, we've designed a framework that would enable anybody, we hope any members of the public, if you're interested, to take a policy announcement and to ask, how transparently has the government set out the evidence for the problem they're trying to address, the interventions that they're considering, and how transparent are they on how they plan to evaluate the impact of these policies. And this is a framework, as I said, we've developed with colleagues that we're planning to turn into a benchmark, if you like, a league table of which departments tell us most transparently about the research behind the evidence. That's something that's ongoing, and hopefully through the next weeks and months you'll hear more about that. I hope this lands well as a comment, and I make it as an outsider. No, I mean, you know, I do make it with a bit of caution, but a lot of the discussion around the need for greater transparency, especially in order to drive more reproducible and reliable research, strikes me as somebody who has most recently been interested in the use of evidence in public policy making as a nice headache to have in many ways, because you are at least able to estimate the nature and extent of the problem within your discipline, of publication bias and of all the other issues that we've heard about. When it comes to the use of evidence in policy making, it turns out we cannot even make a reliable quantitative estimate of how much research is actually missing. So perhaps it's a nice headache to have. It is, of course, amazing to see that the field is taking it very seriously through this meeting and through other discussions as well. Throughout, I think the theme that's come not just from today's talks, from everything I've seen in psychology, is that there is a need for evidence to be open to public scrutiny and to be reported to a standard that really allows replication, and for that to be those practices to be shared across science. I would just argue that that is even more an acute need when it comes to research and in the public interest. And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Pratik, for an excellent final presentation to the more formal part of our agenda. You ended a little bit early, so we've gained 4 minutes. This makes me happy. So we can maybe just talk amongst ourselves for the next 3 minutes, but I think let's use the time more fruitfully. So what we're going to do is move on next to the panel discussion. And can I invite our excellent speakers to take a pew here on our panel. And then what we will plan to do is use a combination of both the comments and questions that have been raised in Slido, but also I want to invite conversations with everyone here. So I know somebody at the break has already asked me about raising a question, but I want that individual to raise a question. So, but remember, we're here to discuss it in a collegiate, positive and upbeat way, all right? So the key thing is, let's try and see, the positives. Let's see where we can move to, and let's try and think of some solutions to the issues that have been raised today. And in fact, I've just realised this is my David Dimbleby moment, so I'm pretty happy. So we've got a panel, I think, like our question time panel, which we've got expertise right across the board. So before I move to Slido, I want to just first of all ask the audience, has anybody got a burning question that you want to kick things off with for our panel? We've got 2 roving mics. We've got Ella and we've Liz, wherever she is. Yes, we've got one question. Ella. And can you please say who you are and before you speak?
My name's Alan Pickering. It's a simple, positive suggestion about improvement. If you may remember when the Higgs boson was finally declared real, it was a second study where the p-value had moved from 3 standard deviations to 5 standard deviations, sigma 3 to sigma 5, and that's when they were happy. So 2 simple suggestions, and does the panel think they would help? We should just decrease the critical p-value considerably, a lot. 2 standard deviations is a very low standard of proof. And secondly, and it's inspired by Roger's talk actually, he chose, in relation to the NOSEC study, very low-powered studies. I mean, your example had power of 50%. 80% actually isn't that high a power. It means one time in 5, you're guaranteeing not to find the effect that's there. So 2 simple recommendations. Increase the minimum level of power substantially, 95 maybe, and decrease the p-value to 0.001 or beyond that other sciences use. How helpful would that be?
Marcus.
So there's actually an interesting example of that within the biomedical sciences actually happening, which is in the field of genetics and genomics. So maybe 20 years ago, candidate gene studies began to become common. They were small. They used a p-value threshold of 0.05. They were predicated on known or presumed biology to select your candidate gene, and people would often test 20 genes but report the one that worked. And those findings basically almost never replicated. Then the technology emerged to allow us to genotype the whole genome simultaneously, 500,000 SNPs up to now 2 million SNPs. And you can't hide from the fact that you've got a multiple testing problem when you're running 500,000 t-tests. So the p-value threshold in genomics is 10 to the minus 8, more stringent than particle physics. At the same time, there was an awareness that the effect sizes were small. So the result of that technological shift was an awareness that people were going to have to collaborate, to pool data, to get the necessary sample sizes, to find everything, and build replication into those studies. So now you have these genome-wide studies that are finding very, very small effects because those are the real effects, but they're doing so very reproducibly through the application of a very stringent p-value threshold, through the application of very large sample sizes, and through the application of built-in replication in those studies. And that can only be achieved through collaboration, by working across multiple labs internationally to bring together the resources available across those labs to get the right answer.
Excellent. Roger.
In some respects, I should maybe explain that I'm not a statistician as such. What I am is someone who's been acquiring experience in how you use it. And what I have to say to that is this. First of all, if you reduce alpha, the p-value that we call the criterion, lower, then indeed you reduce the type 1 error rate, although human ingenuity, fraud or whatever you like to say, will find ways around it nonetheless. And if that is the issue, then reducing the p-value won't affect it. All it does is put the cost of doing the science up because we all need to run more participants. So that doesn't seem to me to be the way forward. And actually I didn't show you, I have a graph that shows within the system I was looking at, which is low powered, if you reduce alpha, then replication rate drops. And that's because a large part of the replication rate is being driven by type 2 errors, misses, not false alarms in the first place. And as you reduce alpha, the criterion, to 0.01 or 0.001 or what have you, you at the same time increase type 2 error rates. The issue is essentially this. We're trying to infer a property of a population, a large population, from a tiny sample. And the fact of taking a tiny sample means that our estimate is subject to very large uncertainty. And we're using our level best here to try and manage that uncertainty. It's undoubtedly the case that if we manage to get standard power in psychology up anywhere close to 80%, 90%, then we wouldn't have as much of an issue. But we would also typically be seeing a distribution of p-values that was much smaller than the one we see. So long as we set our goal on getting a p-value under some criterion, we are committing ourselves to a power distribution across all studies that is not what we wish. The system, statistics as it is, doesn't work in that sense very well for psychology. If you go back to the question of we want to infer a property of a population from a very small sample, then we all understand that if you increase that sample, you'll get better data. It seems to me there's an awful lot to be said for making sure that that increase doesn't happen in one place. So instead of, my putative colleague in Stirling, instead of running 50 participants, runs 150. Seems to me better they do 50, someone somewhere else does another 50, someone somewhere else does another 50. We still have 150 participants, but we at the very least have managed to generalize to slightly different sampling populations rather than the real population. Yeah? The reason I'm going to say that emphatically is because one of the things that no one's addressed here is the issue of non-independence between participants. If your participants all went to the same psychology lecture yesterday, or all went out drinking at the same pub last week, then to a degree, they're no longer independent samples. And non-independence behaves exactly the same as lying about the degrees of freedom. It's essentially fabricating data. So smaller samples, but more of them, does seem typically to me to be better, and that would argue against any one study having high power, but having a high power in the system acquired by lots of samples distributed.
Roger, I'm going to stop you there, just I'm conscious of time as well, and get
Sorry.
other panels in. Thanks for that. Dorothy, I know you want to come in, and Nick.
Well, only that I don't really, because I think Roger's probably said much what I wanted to say, which is just that I was worried that he's giving the impression in some of what he says that low power is somehow a feature of psychology that we can't do anything about. I think a lot of the problems that we have are to do with low power, and that we need to build power by these collaborations. I think the idea of us each doing our own little thing. So I'm with you, Roger, as far as you go, let's have lots of different centres, but let them all work together and pool their data, it would be my suggestion.
Great stuff. And just one final comment from Nick, and we'll move on.
The cynic in me feels that what appears to be being proposed here is a substantial reduction in the number of principal investigators. I'm not quite certain whether that's going to receive universal approval. Again, we're back to the turkeys voting for Christmas here. It would be great if we multiplied all our sample size. Of course it would. With constant funding, fewer PIs. You want to take that lottery? Up to you.
Interesting point indeed. So I'm going to move now on to our first Slido question. So Charlotte, unfortunately, I have to break the news to you. You're no longer the top of the poll. But well done nonetheless. We might come to you yet. The winning question so far is by Punit Shah. Is Punit still in the room? Punit, do you want to ask your question?
I've forgotten the exact word. Oh, okay, great. Reproducibility is being prioritised, perhaps at the cost of efforts to improve validity in experimental design. No? Question mark.
Great question, Punit. Who would like to take that on the panel? So is there a trade-off between... Let's kick off with Dorothy.
I would say no. These things are not mutually exclusive. I think improving validity in experimental design is part of improving reproducibility. So,
why hasn't that been discussed at all today?
Well, I only had 20 minutes.
Dorothy, it's not all about you.
If you look at the Academy of Medical Sciences report that I referenced at the end of my thing, there is a lot on that. And Marcus and Chris and I will be running a course on improving methodology and with a goal of getting to greater reproducibility next April, which will run for 3 consecutive years and is funded by the BBSRC. So we're very concerned about those issues.
Roger, briefly, and then Marcus. Roger?
Just very briefly, I want just to connect the question you ask with the power issue. Right? In essence, what psychology has to do is find a way of decreasing type 2 error rates whilst not increasing type 1 error rates. And if we knew how to do that, and there are ways you can do that, then we would be in a much better shape in terms of reproducibility without necessarily incurring the costs of running additional participants. So there are other ways in which you can reduce type 2 error rate, increase power by an appropriate sampling design, for example.
Okay, great. Marcus, should I say a few words?
Just to agree with Dorothy that that's definitely part of this kind of broader issue. I did briefly touch on Malcolm McLeod's work about the reporting of experimental design features in animal studies, which showed that actually the reporting of things like randomization and blinding and sample size calculations is very poor, and particularly so in papers from the best institutions. So clearly there's room to improve there. And I think, one part of what we need to grapple with, which goes back to Nick's point to an extent, is that perhaps we need to be doing fewer studies, larger studies, better studies, which includes design, to be more focused on getting the right answer rather than simply generating publications which advance our own careers. But the problem with that at the moment is that the incentives just don't stack up. If you want to do that as an individual lab or PI or researcher, then you're essentially putting yourself at a disadvantage relative to the field.
Just one second, I know someone in the audience would like to come in. Ella, this gentleman, if you raise your hand, please. You want to come in? Okay, great. So thanks for that. So that's great. So let's go back to Slido, because again, the second most important question does come from Charlotte. So Charlotte, would you like to repeat your question now, please?
Essentially it was more of a statement really, was whether we need to actually start at the undergraduate level where we show students that this is actually a way of working and that we should be doing this sort of
Okay, so just to summarize those who may not have heard, so the key issue there is, should we start changing the culture right at the beginning at undergraduate level? And also, the second point was dealing with, should we get projects that students do also be pre-registered in some sort of way? I'm pretty certain Marcus is going to say something about that.
Sorry, I don't want to hog this, but absolutely. And I think I'd say 2 points about that. One is that my experience of giving this kind of talk is that there's a huge appetite amongst early career researchers, particularly PhD students and postdocs, because they are at the point where they've come into science enthusiastic, perhaps a little bit naive about how it works, and they're starting to feel themselves get bent out of shape by the need to publish, generate a CV, and continue their careers. And so they're feeling that tension very acutely, and I think undergraduates feel that too to some extent. Within my own group, we now routinely pre-register all of our undergraduate projects. All of the data that they generate are made open. They're published on the University of Bristol repository, which assigns them a DOI so they can be cited. And getting to that point took time. We had to do it slowly. We had to change our consent procedures and so on. But once you've got to that point, actually it becomes self-sustaining. It's not as much work as people might think.
Okay. And just, Pratik, do you want to come in?
I just briefly, because it strikes me there's something that ties that question into the previous one and something that Dorothy mentioned earlier. Now, I'm all for having undergraduates running random data. I would love to have that as more of a usual practice. I would love to see journalists being asked to get a better understanding of the difference between an individual study, whatever its power and whatever its significance, and the difference between that and the system as a whole and what that's telling us, the body of research as a whole and what that's telling us. So, of course, we'd want to work to get better practices through at the undergraduate level, but let's think of this from a system, from the other side of things, and how things are reported in the media, how things are written up through the journal system that we've heard a lot about today as well. It's just as important that not just undergraduates in research, but undergraduates full stop understand better the difference between individual studies and what a broader body of research might tell us.
I think societies have a role to play there in educating the media and the journalists at that other end of the spectrum. There's a role there to kind of embed that way of thinking, or to educate the journalists around how to report on these issues too.
Sure, excellent. Thanks for that. I mean, is someone else trying to come in? Derek, you trying to come in there?
Yeah, I'm Derek Moore from Surrey. I was just kind of following up on one of the incentives that's coming through is actually the impact agenda, in that there is going to be extra pressure not only to obviously create impactful papers and things, but actually to get them into practice. And although Nick's saying we're not sticking things in planes and causing them to crash, we are actually informing practice. We are informing clinical work, and if we're not doing replications before that gets into the process of creating impact, there is a danger there. And I think I just wanted to know whether people felt that was a significant thing or not.
Great stuff. Thanks, Derek. Colleagues? Nick?
I do worry about how these underpowered, tiny little studies are impacting public policy. I don't think sometimes that people really consider the consequences of that, though. I think the people who are trying to get these flashy results. Also, you've just got the general problem of grad students have to get a paper. We've got to get a publication. We've got to get something. We're turning out maybe too many grad students. We're maybe graduating too many psychologists, and we're just generating this massive write-only literature that nobody ever reads except if it's particularly flashy. I've argued but normally it takes a couple of drinks at the bar before people will talk to me about it, that we probably need about 80% less psychologists and give the same money to the same, and give them 5 times more money each. And actually a lot of people are quite receptive to this agreement because they all seem to think they're going to be one of the 20% who survive, which is an interesting example of bias. But I think maybe we're spreading our resources too thin.
Certainly an interesting point about the incentive structure. Sorry, is someone trying to come in? Ella there.
Yeah, just following on from that, I just wanted to raise concern about the impact that exaggerated claims about the benefits of rehabilitation have been having upon public discussion about welfare reform and disability cuts. And I know that a controversial example at the moment is the only medical trial the Department of Work and Pensions have funded, the PACE trial, where researchers have refused to release data for the outcomes they laid out in their protocol and have been smearing those requesting that data. So, yeah, I do think that a lot of the discussion here has been quite abstract and maybe a bit too friendly and positive, when some of the harm that's been done is really affecting people's lives quite immediately.
Sure. I mean, that's a great point. I mean, let's keep it general as opposed to get to a specific case that you're referring to. Anybody want to comment on the impact of that gap between evidence and policy? Pratik and Marcus, do you want to come in?
I'm glad that was raised, because we may not fly planes with psychological research, but we may base hundreds of millions of pounds worth of spending decisions on research of questionable quality. And by that I mean I'd need to question the quality of the research. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's dodgy or bad, or and that's the key thing, that whether it's products or public decisions or our decisions in the marketplace, it's good. It was much better if we can see more of what's being done. I'm really quite concerned about particularly one area. I'm speaking personally, behavioural psychology and its potential impact on policy making. A real potential there to give real insights for policymakers into how people actually behave out in the real world, not the self-selecting same crowd of 100 college students perhaps, but people in the real world, how they behave. If that's not subjected to the same publication transparency requirements, you're basing a lot of public spending decisions on, I'm not quite sure what. The discipline, though, from everyone I've spoken to within behavioural psychology that I'm familiar with, is aware of that limitation.
Excellent. Thanks, Pratik. Marcus, did you want to say a few words? I know Roger briefly as well.
Just very briefly that there will not be any single solution to the problems that we've talked about. This is a highly interconnected system of incentives and behaviours, and things like open data, for example, and data sharing certainly can be part of the solution. But even there are complexities. In our case, we've moved towards open data, but that's required us to change our consent procedures. And if you haven't consented participants for their data to be made open, then you can't do it. If participants could be identified because you're dealing with a small population of people with a particular condition, for example, then there can be complexities there too. So there need to be a number of different potential solutions as part of a mixed package, if you like, if we think that there is a problem here. But those solutions themselves will be complex and will need some consideration.
Excellent. Roger.
Sorry, this will be very brief. I just want to emphasise the point in argument, Nick, really, that psychology impact does matter. There are any number of impact case studies from the last ref where it seems to me that important things that change people's lives, are happening on the basis of psychological evidence, and we shouldn't undersell the importance of psychology. For me, the issue behind this is that the world out there wants black and white answers. Women are cleverer than men, or whatever it is. We sort of know that it's not like that none of these things, these categories, intelligence or what have you, are so clear and so isolated from everything else inside our mind that you can treat them in that way, that the system is too complex. So the way the public understands and wishes psychology to be heard seems to me to be a big part of this. And it's not just the general public. I've been involved as an expert witness in a number of court cases where the judge has wanted a black or white answer, where there clearly can't be one.
Indeed. I mean, just to endorse that very comment, because those of you may be familiar with, if you look at the impact case studies, that there's been recent work done at King's where they were able to show that nearly 2/3 of case studies had some sort of social science link in them. So the idea that psychology is doing great work, I completely agree, but of course, unfortunately, there's many examples where there's the gap of the evidence. We had an example from the audience and other examples here. Okay, I want to just move on and we'll come back to other general comments, because we're here about replication and we're here about whether or not there's a crisis. So one of the third most popular comments or questions on Slido is anonymous, so I assume anonymous is no longer in the room. But the question is to hear the panel's view and the audience views on what's happened subsequently. So we had Nalzak's paper in Science, but there's been a huge debate after that, in particular very recently, the Gilbert rebuttal. And that's entirely what I wanted to hear. So this is kind of, I'm assuming, a perfect point to bring in Dorothy. Dorothy, you want to say a few words on that?
Yeah, the Gilbert rebuttal. Well, it was taken down beautifully by a guy called Sanjay I can't pronounce his surname, Srivastava, in a blog called, thank you, in a blog called Hard Science. I mean, he was making certain assumptions, which a lot of what he was saying would not be very dissimilar, in fact, to what Roger was saying about that study, in that he was saying that if the confidence intervals that you get in the original study overlap with the confidence intervals in a replication, then it's fine. He completely ignored sample size. He completely ignored the fact, or it was a group of authors, that in general, in that replication study, there was a deliberate attempt made to make sure there was adequate power, or as far as we could establish it, in most of those replications, so that the expectation was not that you would just get another result with a big confidence interval around it. You should get a smaller one. But that they ignored power. The other thing that they did was to start then saying, well, there might have been slight differences in the conditions and so on, to which my response is, well, if your results are so fragile that unless you do everything exactly the same way, they don't stand up, then really, what use are they? So I'm not impressed by the Gilbert rebuttal. And for those who want to get into the statistics of the rebuttal, I would say look at that blog post on the Hard Science blog, which I have actually already tweeted about.
Indeed. So we are here about it's a debate. So does anybody support Gilbert's rebuttal, or anybody in the room? Because I know certainly, speaking to colleagues in the United States, they would suggest it's not as clear-cut as Dorothy has just suggested. Is anyone willing to stand up for that? Nick, I suspect you're not, though, but anyway.
It's interesting to note, actually, how almost immediately the debate about the replication project became very much like a debate about any other paper, and there were sort of just, it all got very meta. We were discussing whether this was a valid statistic and this was a valid whatever. But really, I just see a bunch of people who got where they are under the old system and justifying that system. There's a nice meme taken from one of the Police Squad movies where a car has just driven into a firework factory which is exploding, and Leslie Nielsen is standing there going, "Nothing to see here, folks. There's nothing to move along. There's nothing to." And that was pretty much the reaction. It really was. I think they said the actual replication result is statistically indistinguishable from 100%. I mean, that's, we can discuss the details of their, but the assertion that 36% is statistically indistinguishable from 100%, I'd be very interested to see what the standard deviation has to be for that to be true.
So as I suspected, that's a no then from you, Nick. Marcus.
So I, like Dorothy and Nick, was not convinced by the Gilbert critique. I do think that Nick picks up on a good point, that the people who are shaping the system at the moment are the ones who've won the game. They've succeeded within the current incentive structure. So they wouldn't see a problem. Why would they? They're sitting at the top of the pile going, well, it all worked for me. Look at me, I'm sitting at the top. So we have to be aware of that from our own positions of privilege. We have to be aware of motivated reasoning on both sides, and I get invited to give lots of nice talks about how terrible everything is. So, of course, I become invested in talking about how terrible everything is. So I need to be conscious of my own biases, and that's the kind of thing that we as psychologists should be better at than the most. But I think sometimes we lack a little bit of insight into our own biases, and I refer back to that Ian Edis paper that I mentioned, that if you've published in a certain area, you are more likely to interpret ambiguous results as supporting your own work than if you're a methodologist. So we need people from the outside critiquing our work. And frankly, when people like particle physicists look at what we do, they kind of roll their eyes and think that we need to do a bit of soul searching.
Is Psych Brief in the room? Psych Brief? No? Psych Brief raises a really interesting point. Oh, is that Psych Brief at the back? Psych Brief, can we get a mic to Psych Brief? I need you. Because you raise a really interesting point about a recent Nature paper. Would you mind saying your name and maybe reiterating your question?
Well, the reason I go by Psych Brief is because I write a pseudonymous blog, so I'm going to stick with that for the moment.
Sure.
Even though my name's on my shirt. Moving swiftly onwards.
But is your name reproducible?
Why not? The question I asked was, there was a recent paper in Nature that said 7% of the sampled psychologists said that there was no crisis at all. And I was wondering what you would say to them to convince them that there is, or something along those lines.
Great question. Thanks for that. Anybody? Chris, do you want to respond?
Yeah, they just need to get out and read a bit more. I mean, there's no mystery here. I mean, the evidence that there's a problem is incontrovertible, frankly. There's no room for debate there anymore. There will always be people. It's like climate change, There'll be a corner of any community that wants to deny there's a problem. But I don't think they have any room to move, and that's reflected, in fact, by the majority in that poll who agree there is a problem. the problem with burying, if we start trying to argue there isn't a crisis, and I think we can debate whether crisis is the right word, we can come up with other words, but the minute we start debating whether it exists or not, we're kind of pushing away the opportunity to develop ways of doing better science generally. And that's not just, we haven't even scratched the surface today about the other initiatives that are out there. One such as the PRO initiative, in which peer reviewers ask authors to either share data and materials or to provide a public reason why they cannot share or choose not to share, which is a fantastic initiative, a grassroots initiative, which could really transform the landscape in many areas of science by making the decisions that authors make about transparency themselves transparent. And in a way, regardless of whether you think there's a crisis, even if you're one of that 7%, these initiatives are fundamentally positive, in my view.
Actually, Chris, now that you have the mic, there's a very excellent question from Dermot Lynott, which I'm going to ask here on Dermot's behalf. He said, how does Chris Chambers feel about the likely, I was just going to leave it at feel, but many things. So how does Chris Chambers feel about the likely success of the pre-registration format, given Roger Watt's pessimistic statistic on the plausible replication rates of around 40 to 45%?
Well, Roger's estimates are all predicated on a ceiling to statistical power, which he applies in his own simulations. Cortex, for example, and many of the other journals which offer registered reports, we require a much higher level of power. We set a minimum of 90%. And in fact, many authors exceed that on purpose because they want to have results that mean something. If you put that into Roger's simulations, you'll get very different answers about reproducibility rates. So I think I'm quite optimistic. I still think there's a long way for this initiative to go because it's a very radical model of publishing. We're not familiar with seeking peer review on detailed aspects of our experiments before they're conducted, when we're far too accustomed to assessing quality of science based on outcomes of hypothesis testing. If you got an effect, you did a good job. If you didn't, you probably messed something up. There's an enormous amount of circular reasoning there and bias there, which we have to overcome. But I think all we can do is create the options. So I'm quite optimistic as this format becomes more and more popular and itself leads to other, innovative steps forward, not just within registered reports, but in other areas. I think we're looking pretty good.
Okay, so I think it's only fair to allow Roger to respond. He was wanting to come in, and then Dorothy.
Well, let me say two things. The first thing I want to say is it seems to me that credibility of psychology matters, and whatever can be done to enhance the credibility of psychology is worth contemplating. But equally, one has to consider that some measures that might be proposed will prove costly and will reduce the number of PIs, for example, and that seems to be not in the general health of the wider population. So I think that has to be part of the context here. Now I think the thing I want to caution against is this. For maybe 100 years, certainly for 50 years, we've lived with a p-value that matters. And we now know that p-value not only is arbitrary, but is in lots of ways very, very misleading and unhelpful. My concern would be that we replace that p-value that you obtain from a tiny sample from a large population by a power that you obtain from a tiny sample from a large population, and essentially propagate the issue from one variable that behaves in a very difficult way onto another. I would say, and I could go on forever, but I won't, I'll shut up very soon, that maybe one of the things that needs to come out of this, on top of all these things that are being said, is that psychology reinvestigates its relationship with statistics. Long way down the list, so we'll never come to it, somebody said something along the lines of, so does any of this apply to qualitative research? Well, the answer is yes. If you're taking samples from a population, it applies there as well. The fact that you're not calculating numbers and quantities and so on doesn't absolve you from the issues of generalising from a tiny sample to a big population.
Great, thanks for that, Roger. Dorothy.
I just wanted to come back to the pre-registration and say that as somebody who's done one of these pre-registered reports, I think there is a bonus to it that is not really generally appreciated, and that is that whereas you normally in the old days would write your paper, send it away, and go around many rounds of reviews where the reviewers keep telling you what you should have done if you know, or perhaps even telling you to run another experiment where you do it completely different. With this method, you get your referee comments in before you do the study. And that, in this one instance where I did it with a graduate student, Hannah Hobson, it was fantastic because we built in controls into the study that we would not otherwise have built in. We made it pretty watertight. And of course, the poor girl had to test 3 times as many people as had ever been tested in this paradigm before to get adequate power. But it's ended up in her interest because she's got a very strong study with results that we actually believe. But this business about getting your referee reports in early, I think is often missed, and to me it's a huge bonus. It's not something you have to do, though, with pre-registration. So you don't have to go through the Cortex route and do it, or you can just, if you're in short time and you've got undergraduate projects and things, you can just develop a protocol and dump it on somewhere like Open Science Framework to have it there. But even that I'm finding really helpful because it's forcing me to think through the detail of what I'm going to do before I do it. And I can, with hand on heart, say, for many years I did not do that. I thought, oh, let's do a study. Oh, yeah, let's get a few measures, let's do this. And, you know, before you know where you are, you're sort of halfway through and then you suddenly think, oh, I should have anticipated this. I am as guilty as anybody, and I think it's a way a lot of us have been trained, and I think the question about undergraduate training comes in here because Kate
Dorothy,
Butter...
I'm just going to leave it there because I'm conscious other panel members want to get in and we've only 10 magic minutes left.
Okay,
so,
I will stop.
Marcus.
But Kate Button is the woman to look out for.
Very briefly, it does feel like we're in the middle of a quite an exciting natural experiment. There are lots of third-party providers offering opportunities for pre-submission peer review through the archiving of preprints, post-publication peer review, open data, pre-registration, registered reports. Chris and I are in discussions with a number of funders about linking funding to a registered report with a journal, so you get funding and the acceptance in principle offer from the journal so that you're then funded and know that when you complete your work, you'll have your publication pretty much there straight away to make the whole pipeline more efficient. As I said earlier, many of the ways in which we do our work are decades or even centuries old, and it's probably time for an update. And the more people who participate in this natural experiment and engage with these different ways of working, the more data we'll have about what works in the long run.
Excellent, Marcus. Thanks for that. I want to just kind of turn to quite a number of people on Slido have talked about the role of the publisher. So I know we're very lucky here to Catherine on the panel. And one particular comment has been about the incentive structure or otherwise from the publisher's point of view. So why, and someone relatedly flagged is open access, the idea of pre-registration is great, but it's not necessarily open access as well. So Catherine, do you want to give any comments on that general idea that how you see the future in terms of Wiley and other publishers trying to support in a way which works for everyone?
I think we saw from some of the latter slides in my presentation that publishers, not just Wiley, but lots of publishers are trying to do lots of different experiments with third parties in order to support the open science framework and to support authors in their drive towards more reproducibility. So providing or establishing systems and relationships with repositories so that data can be made available during the peer review process and journals can be can apply a rigorous review process to the data as well as the paper is one of the ways that we're supporting that. Go ahead. Do you want to come in?
Oh, no, finish what you're saying. Just I'm waving it. I'm waving it down to say when you finish. Have you finished? Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
I've been involved in 2 cases in the past year where authors took advantage of open data badges to get, we've got open data, and then changed the data after publication. We were completely scandalised by this. So if you're going to make it, put some good tracking on it, including alerting people that it's been changed, because people will go, oh yeah, great, we got the open database, so nobody will question what we're doing, and then come along later and upload a new version.
I think there's an important role for societies and for journal editors here too in actually enforcing data sharing practices. You know, publishers can collaborate and can put processes in place to facilitate data sharing to help move towards reproducibility. But if if the people, the editors, the associate editors, the reviewers aren't on board with that, aren't helping to ensure that that practice is actually being followed, then you're going to have a very unsatisfactory situation. I think there's a role for the community as a whole to apply a rigorous set of kind of standards or guidelines to the sharing of data. And I think there's a role for societies there in developing those and embedding them within the practice of researchers.
Okay, thanks for that, Catherine. So I'm going to move on to one final question, then we'll take a few from the audience. Lots of people at different stages and different slight nuanced questions have touched upon p-values, myself included, so thank you for the 4 people who liked my question. I was hoping for more. But the issue is it time to abolish p-values? So, panel, discuss. Roger. I don't know, Chris, did you want to come in and then Roger?
If you asked E.J. Wagenmakers, he'd say absolutely yes. I mean, there's a growing movement of Bayesian experts and statisticians and psychologists who would argue that the time of the p-value has come and gone, and that it doesn't tell us what we need to know. And it's a very obscure statistic. I bet if I was to take a poll right now, half of you would get it wrong. And I would have got it wrong, actually, until relatively recently. Definitely. And it's the Bayes factor is a much more intuitive measure of evidence than a p-value. So there's a lot to be said for thinking about different ways of performing inferential testing.
Absolutely. I mean, interestingly, I think you're right, many people just are unclear about that. Marcus and then Nick, and then, in fact, it'll be probably the whole panel. Marcus.
I think we need to be a bit careful about methods that are currently used by early adopters who are specialists in those methods. It's a bit like Macs versus PCs in the old days. When not many people had Macs, there were no viruses for Macs because there was no point in programming one. Now that there are more Macs, there are more viruses for Macs. If everyone started using Bayesian statistics with the same level of knowledge that we now apply to frequentist statistics, I think we would see similar problems that we're seeing with frequentist statistics. Really, it's horses for courses. The Higgs boson guys used a frequentist approach and reported a p-value. It was fine for them because they had a very well-specified model of what the universe would look without a Higgs boson and with a Higgs boson. We tend to have much less well-specified models. We can't make such clear quantitative predictions, and we apply our tools badly. I think training is a big part of the solution.
Indeed, training it very much is. Can we be very brief, please?
Just if I can come back on that. I mean, if you want to, one of the consequences of what we're going through at the moment is we're going to see more negative results published, more null results are going to be published. And if you want to draw any inferential conclusion whatsoever on the basis of a negative finding, you need a Bayes factor. A p-value is entirely uninformative. So we are going to have to adopt Bayesian methods if we're going to be able to interpret the new evidence that is going to start coming into the published pool.
Great. Roger?
It seems to me that it's extremely unlikely that there are any 2 variables that research psychologists are interested in that aren't related at some level and through some set of consequences. In that sense, testing the null hypothesis is simply a surrogate for trying to decide whether or not the effect size is sufficiently big to matter for my theory or not. And it seems to me that that process is too indirect, the logic of using p-value for something it wasn't ever designed for. It was designed for deciding whether or not this fertilizer enhances yield of crop. Yeah? There's a lovely paper from 1960 that I can't remember the reference of that begins on the proposition that all psychological variables are related to each other just by differing amounts. And that leads you, I think, to abandon p-value. Second thing we said is this, that the graph I showed you with the red top half and the green bottom half applies to every situation where your median p-value is 0.05. So any number of different designs and populations, if the median value is 0.05, you have that. It seems to me to be rather dangerous to use a distribution that is so broad.
Okay, great stuff. Pratik, do you want to come in?
Just very briefly to say that it really is more, in my opinion, to do, and I'm far from an expert, to do with how we talk about results that fall either side of a arbitrary marker. It's the confidence in which we invest in results that fall one side of a marker. Whether you decide to use Bayesian statistics or other methods, I'd be wary of shifting that problem of putting too much confidence into something that happens to be significant and just parking the problem somewhere else. And that really does go back to how we as a society talk about the significance or otherwise, not the statistical significance, the relevance and significance of significant research, if you like.
Okay, just time for one or two final questions. One here and one here, please. So just start here on the left. Mike here, Liz, that'd be great.
In this most recent discussion, I'm surprised that nobody on the panel pointed out that there is an alternative to p-values and Bayesian, and that is looking at effect sizes and their confidence intervals, something that's a lot more accessible to most psychologists than the Bayesian approaches. It's better established, and it's been better established, among the population of psychologists for a longer time. And it gives you the tools to both conclude that there is an effect that matters to us, it's of a size that is important, or whatever effect there is so small that it doesn't matter. And when we're looking at applying psychology, the impact that psychology has, nobody cares yes/no answers, is there an effect or not? What they really care about is, what is the size of the effect and does it matter?
Indeed. Thank you very much. Can we hold that thought? I'm just take the second question and we'll answer them in concert, I would hope to think.
Okay. I think most of the discussion, sorry, Brian Rogers, I think most of the discussion on the panel has a sort of assumed that psychology is common in terms of having a problem. And it seems to me that this might not be true. And looking at Roger smiling, we both work in vision sciences, and it seems to me that actually the reproducibility of results is probably extremely high. And this is despite the fact, and this is relevant to the whole debate about p-values, of course, despite the fact that the number of observers that are typically used is probably in single digits. I'm thinking of Roger's lovely paper on mirage and edge finding. I can't remember how many observers, but it's very small. So it seems to me that it's not really one size fits all, but rather, relating it to Dorothy's point, it seems to me that it's not that we're less susceptible to fraud or to incentives to publish and incentives to get research grants. It seems to me that those differences are much more due to the nature of the methodology and having the appropriate tools to be able to answer those questions. That's where the big differences arise.
Excellent. And as David Dimbleby would say at this point, we have run out of time. So can we leave those two comments just floating in the air in a magical way that comments like these at the end of such a discussion will float? So can I just first of all thank our panel, and before I say a few concluding words. Okay, it's apposite at times like this to say some thanks. So first of all, can I begin by thanking the audience, thanking you all for being here. Because, we had a huge uptake. Within 2 days, the Eventbrite program had shown that this had sold out, and we had to increase the number of people. So this is a really exciting, important endeavour, and everyone is interested in it. So thank you very much for attending. And also can we thank our 7 excellent speakers. I thought we had a really amazing balance of talks, from real issues about the replication crisis, about solutions, about very interesting angles on when it goes wrong, fraud, the incentive structures, the policy angle, the registered reports, and also excellent input in terms of the future for publishing and how we may work differently in the future. But I'd also like to thank the Joint Committee for Psychology in Higher Education. And I'd like to thank David Donaldson, if he's still here. David, where are you? David at the back. David, again, like myself, was one of the key people to conceive this idea. John Towes, who isn't here, from Lancaster. And also, can I ask Lisa Morrison Coulthard to stand up, please, Lisa? I know this is exactly what you don't want. And can I also ask Liz Beach to make herself known? Where is Liz from the BPS? Thank you, Liz. The reality is this event wouldn't happen without Lisa's excellent work and Liz's, and it has been a lot of work. And the small part was getting a great team together. The hard part was the fine details of making it happen. So I'd also like to thank Wiley. We've got 3 representatives of Wiley here. Wiley are sponsoring what I love, the euphemism, a networking wine reception. So thank you very much, Wiley, and also given that the support you give to the society more generally. And overall, it leaves me just to say we are 3 minutes over time. I'd say that's pretty good. So please, can we continue our discussions? My feeling is the take-home message is we have had an upbeat exciting collegiate conversation. I actually genuinely believe we're at a crucial time for psychological science. The future is bright, and the idea of training, we really need to think how we train our scientists better, our psychological scientists, to deal with the issues that we've talked about today. But the idea of transparency is something we need to very much push forward on. But really, I think we are ahead of the game. We are way ahead of most of our colleagues, and I think it's important we don't forget that. And we should be spreading the message. We are the people today having an event discussing psychological science and how we can make it better. So I think well done to all of us, well done to the Royal Society for hosting us. Please go forward and enjoy the networking wine reception. Thank you.